Thanks very much everyone for coming along. I'm Phil Jones and I'm sort of representing the organising committee this morning. A fine band of thieves and rogues who have come together to organise what is the third of our annual Digital Geographies Research Group Symposium. Now, Dorothea is somewhere. No, Dorothea is not somewhere. Dorothea has wandered off. Dorothea is the chair of the Digital Geographies Research Group. We're the newest research group of the Royal Geographical Society. We've got our research group status last year. It's open to all. If you're already a member of the RGS, just tick the box in the subscription form. If you aren't a member of the RGS but would like to join, then we have details on our website about how to pay your nominal fee of £5 a year to become a member of the group. We have obviously our annual symposium, we have sponsorship of conference sessions, and we have a whole slew of really exciting conference sessions coming up at this year's RGS conference. We also have our AGM there, so if anybody wants to come along and join the committee, that's always a welcome thing. We've also going to be, hopefully, fingers crossed, starting an undergraduate dissertation prize in next year's round. So if you want to join the prize judging committee for that, again, volunteers always welcome. There's details of yes, please volunteer. Details on digitalrgs.org, or just drop any of us an email. Tweeting today, digitalrgs, and the hashtag we've been using is DGRG19 for today's event. And Hannah, who has been doing sterling work, Hannah at the back there, who has been doing sterling work on the organisational side, is going to be handing out an evaluation form at the end of the day. A couple of housekeeping things. The first thing is that we're filming and indeed streaming today. If you are sitting on this side of the room, then you're not in the stream, and if you're sitting at the back of the other room, then you're not in the stream. If you don't want your talk filmed, let us know before you give your talk and we'll hit pause. We're not expecting any fire alarms this morning, so if there are any alarms, and they did test them earlier and they do seem to be working, so if there are any alarms, the emergency exits are the way that you came in, the sort of front stairs, and if those are blocked for any reason, then you head down this corridor and there's a back set of stairs, you can go down there. Toilets on this corridor and on the top of the stairs where we came in, they're only little, so if you're desperate and there is a queue, the ground floor opposite the Bratby bar, there's a very large set of bathrooms down there. Lunch is booked for 12:45. I've booked a kind of mix of vegan and non-vegan options. If you can't find anything you like, give us a shout. There's cafes and whatnot all around campus, so you can hopefully be able to find something that suits your tastes. If those of you who are able to stick around, we will go down to the ground floor of this building where we have the Bratby bar for a drink after the symposium, if people want to. When sort of pitched the idea for a kind of gaming workshop for this year's symposium, one of the sort of brutal reasons was the kind of, oh, there's Dorothea, our president, so if you want to talk about Digital Geographies Research Group, grab Dorothea in the lunch break. Sort of brute economic value to sector. I love doing stuff like this where you go, okay, so the estimated value of the sector is about 138 billion last year, which our two oldest industrial sectors, our two oldest economic sectors, agriculture and construction. Well, that's a sizable portion of those two sectors in terms of its value. So gaming is a big deal. It's not kids stuff, although obviously some of it is. But it's actually worth a hell of a lot of money. And so sort of dismiss it as, oh, it's niche, it's not. It's a hugely important thing, if for no other reason than the sheer amount of money that's involved. But also there's the social and cultural implications. And one of the things which I found really interesting more recently getting into gaming stuff is there's scholarship in games for donkey's years. And that's a shock to me coming to this new. And there's a great piece on Game Studies, the journal was launched, talking about this is representing an interdisciplinary research area. It's emerging, it's exciting, it's dynamic, and fast forward to the kind of last couple of years, and it's no longer so emerging, and it's been this sort of weird irony that instead of it just being that game studies has been the place for interdisciplinary collaboration, that disciplines themselves have started to take gaming seriously. And so there's been a bit of a retreat to the disciplines to actually study these things. That being said, really healthy interest in geography. Obviously, for years we've known about James Ash's work. Lots of other people have been doing games as a bit of a sideline. And what's been really exciting in the last few years is that a collection of really exciting early career scholars have been pushing this agenda forward hard. And a lot of those folk are in the room today, so hearing from some of those guys later on. That being said, still much for us to learn as geographers from the disciplines, and we've got a very interdisciplinary group of people here today, which I'm really excited about. One of the things, as a geographer coming late into looking at games, that I found really interesting is that game studies as a sort of interdisciplinary discipline has not considered space terribly well, and I think that's a big gap for geographers to fill in that area. That's crashed. That's a great start to the probably crashed because I put a 3D model in it, and that's foolish of me. So we picked a bunch of different themes for today when we were advertising it. Some things around gaming landscapes, which is particularly of interest to me, so it gets top billing. So, but there's lots of really exciting things that gaming throws up. That when we were kicking around ideas for this workshop, these are the kind of themes we said, this is what we'd like papers to be about. And I think we've covered most of these themes within the different papers and workshops that we've got on today. Issues around immersion, issues around methodologies, the sort of toxicity and identity, and even to the more philosophical issues, existential ludology and post-phenomenology, which Peter's GMOD workshop this afternoon is going to cover in some depth. I'm also very excited about the 3 keynotes that we've got today. First up, in just a moment, I'll hand over to Sarah Jones, who is head of the School of Media at BCU, just down the way from us. Sarah's had a fascinating career, which I'm sure she will say more about, including doing 360 content and other things for ITN News before moving into the academic sector. But her work on Storyliving, how presence manifests itself in immersive media, again, we shall hear about very shortly. John Sear, hopefully, will turn up shortly. I can't see him yet, but I'm sure he'll be here on time. John is somebody I've worked with on a couple of projects. Software developer, used to work for Codemasters, but he's been doing some really interesting work for his firm, Museum Games, where he's doing much more interactive experiences. So it's about public engagement with gaming technologies, very large-scale things, cross-city, theatre-involved work as well. And then our sort of afternoon keynote after lunch is Natasha Keen from Bangor, who's come across, and she's going to do some really cool paper looking at the way that we can hack identities through counterplay. So in terms of the schedule today, just to make things slightly complicated, we have parallel paper sessions at 11 o'clock. And what we'll do after Sarah's opening keynote is take a bit of a vote, because we have this room and we have a smaller room. And if there's a big disparity between the people wanting to go to each session, we'll put the small session in the smaller room. So we'll take a vote, as I say, just before 11 o'clock. Otherwise, yes, John's keynote will be at 12:15. We've got lunch at 12:45, and then we have digital shorts in the afternoon, which is our opportunity for people who just want to kick an idea around for a couple of minutes, which is something we've done in the last couple of workshops here with Digital Geographies, and seems to work quite well as an opportunity to just pitch a few ideas through. We've also got workshop sessions in the afternoon, and again, we've got parallel sessions here. So we have the Gary's Mod workshop, which is the one which is guaranteed to go wrong. It's being run from Sydney, so we'll see how that works. Gary's Mod workshop and the walking simulator workshop, so choose between those two. And then after tea, we've got the LITCRAFT workshop and the sort of experiencing VR workshop before our closing panel at 4 o'clock. So that's the schedule for today. I'm going to be running around today looking stressed and worried. But I'm going to hand over now to Sarah, who is our first keynote speaker, who I'm very delighted to welcome to Birmingham. So thank you, everyone.
Also in one of those running around looking stressed moments. It's NSS results day today, which means everything to me. day, so it's one of those slightly manic days where people are taking numbers and goodness knows what else. But hopefully, love this moment where I'm just trying to set it up. We're all just looking at it. Yay! Test number 1. Hello, thank you for having me. As Phil said, I live up the road at BCU. I'm head of media, and I do have one of those weird backgrounds. I think we could call it interesting for today. I think generally it's a little bit weird. I probably am that kind of combination of interdisciplinary work. I have a television background, I have a philosophy degree. Now I try and merge it all together in this weird kind of mix of philosophy, media and technology, and just try and have it as a thing rather than defining it in any particular way. I want to talk about story living, and that's the kind of approach that I take. This is going to be all those emails, so let's just bear with it. So I want to talk about story living and kind of an approach that I take for my work, which kind of draws in a lot of those ideas. And I want to start with a proposition from 1989, and what I term as the start of that second wave of VR. We had all like the exciting stuff and the ideas in the kind of 60s, and then died away, and then it came back again in the 90s. And anybody that knows my work knows I'm a completely fangirl after this guy. I worship this guy, his mind, Jared Lanier. If you haven't read anything, go away, order every book and read it. He's a phenomenal mind. And his thought process really defined the technology that he coined as virtual reality. And he says that the thing that's remarkably beautiful to me about virtual reality is that you can make up reality in virtual reality and share it with other people. It's like having a collaborative lucid dream. It's a world without limitations. I'm going to have to just turn that down. Sorry, people are really annoying, aren't they, Nick? And it's a world without limitation, a world as unlimited as dreams. So it's important to go back to that point and remind ourselves of the possibilities and the opportunities that are presented within virtual reality. For me, it is that opportunity of shared dreams, of an unimaginable reality, experiences that we thought were only in our minds, and the ability to create those on different platforms. And the problem is the hype. It's always the hype. It's things like this, these headlines about VR changing the world. It's people like Paris Hilton jumping on a Vive. It's people like Jimmy Fallon using tilt brush, which actually is a really good segment if you haven't seen it, but it is contributing to the problem. It's programs. This is always fun to watch. It's the programs and it's the media perception of what virtual reality is doing. People want immersive technology. There's no doubt about that. They want it to drive forward industries in healthcare, education, training, design, technology. But it's a problem that's faced developments in cultural and technological applications for decades. It's the answer to the question, what is the essence and the value of the technology? Whereas Heim asked in 1996, what is the essence of the technology, the cultural motor that propels it forward? And that's why we need to go back to those questions, the questions raised in the 90s around philosophical framing, around what the technology is for. And through this talk, I hope to address that. Using phenomenological ideas from philosophy and technology and approaches from Heidegger and McLuhan, I argue that by throwing away the rule book, we can define a new medium, one that I call story living. And it's here that we achieve presence. I'm going to go with the assumption that presence is the defining goal in virtual reality. Some of you may argue otherwise. For me, presence is a distinctive form of immersive media, distinguishing it from traditional film, computer games, television, or documentary, where immersion can often be achieved, but not presence. Ryan, in 2013, asked the question that if immersion felt from a book or a film was different from immersion within a virtual space. And she understood the answer to lie in agency. Agency as we become a culture more concerned with interactivity. And the importance of agency for immersion within an experience was also cited by Brown and Kearns in 2003. And they defined immersion within games on 3 levels: engagement, engrossment, and total immersion. And some of the more established work on immersion within media practice comes from Dan Murray, another phenomenal mind, emphasising immersion as a participatory activity. So we see the same feeling from a psychologically immersive experience that we do from a plunge in the ocean or a swimming pool. The sensation of being surrounded by a completely other reality, or as different as water is from air, that takes over all of our attention, our whole perceptual apparatus. For Murray, it's the complexity of the worlds in cyberspace that allows for immersion in new media forms. But presence is distinct. Yes, it has that agency, it has that interactivity, as cited, but there's a deeper level that needs to be understood. There's multiple definitions of what this is. And this is where we get to the really exciting part about it being an interdisciplinary subject, because there are lots of different definitions. We can go back to the original concepts of telepresence and look at people like Sear in the 90s defining this as when the virtual experience dominates being in the real world. The technology that's used produces the experience of being in an environment rather than what's around you. Or Loomis arguing the presence entails some emotional involvement. It's about that connection to the subject, and it's related to different levels of realism. Lombard, who's written a lot around presence and the experience of being in virtual worlds, noted it's achieved when tasks are performed in a virtual environment as if they were in a real environment. And what's interesting, if you put a headset on a younger person, obviously within the health and safety guidelines, you can see them responding in the headset in the way that they would in the real world. I put a 6-year-old inside an ocean reef diving experience, and within a minute they started using their hands as if they were swimming in an ocean. A natural response to being in the environment, and then what Lombard would define as presence. As work cited which defines media presence or inner presence, which we'll come on to, media presence has been the perceptual illusion of non-mediation, where that technology is disappearing from your consciousness, when you're no longer aware of being in a technological space. And inner presence as being more of a neuropsychological phenomenon, evolved from the interplay of our biological and cultural inheritance, where the goal is the control of the human activity. Slater, talking to us as suspension of disbelief, something that will come up time and time again, and Reingold calling it a form of out-of-body experience. But the problem we have is that interdisciplinarity around virtual reality, immersive media. And it's a problem that nobody can agree on a definition or a way of understanding it. Min Lee in 2014 was noting the difficulties in this, saying it's just down to so many different fields of studies, usually with different terminology, and the lack of research on understanding how a virtual experience differs to a human experience, and that ambiguity over different types of presence, whether it's physical, social, or the self. So as a working definition, I try and keep things simple. I don't want to overcomplicate things. I go back to the 90s and all those minds I love so much. And I use the understanding of presence from Pimentel and Texaria. So the question isn't whether the creative world is as real as the physical world, but whether the creative world is real enough for you to suspend your disbelief. So it's our language of Slater again, suspending disbelief in the world. And then the illusion that the mediated experience is not mediated. So for a moment, we lose ourselves in that experience and we're not aware that technology is driving it. It is subjective, it is experiential, and immersion is possible in other forms, art, opera, theatre, but it's presence where you fully give yourself to another reality, and that's the goal for immersive media. So then how can we achieve it through the lived story? So within my work, I look at Hein's essence of the technology, as I mentioned, and those cyberdelic experiences. Barlow in 1990 wrote this incredible article in one of the magazines around virtual reality as an art form. And I interrogate these ideas in practice. Within these experiences, how we gain presence and create that idea of lucid dreaming by not being tied to a directed narrative is explored. I am largely influenced by the work of Lanier, with the objective to find this fictitious planet with new continents you can dive into to find new realities. why these were all cut off. I'll put them online somewhere later. The thing that's remarkably beautiful to me about virtual reality is that you can make up reality in virtual reality and share it with other people. And that idea is something that just explores the creativity with so many people. By focusing on this, we can forget about the technology and understand phenomenological reasoning around experience. We look back to Heidegger, who began to explore humanity's relationship with technology as something that is experienced when it's able to freely develop, freely explore, to develop a true sense of meaning. With Merleau-Ponty analysing where our philosophy is developed by the experience of bringing truth into being. This is just random work that I just put on the screen. This approach seeks to articulate the essence of the technology, which has helped to gain much deeper perspectives of immersive media as the technology advances and develops. Crucial to his thinking, Heidegger explains that the essence of technology is nothing technological. We want to forget about the actual technology and understand what we see when we let it go. Dreyfus asks for a return to the beginning before technological advances. The technology does not make sense in itself, so we need to understand what the technology is revealing to us or disclosing to us to fully understand its meaning and place in society. Within virtual reality, we can start applying these terms to the practice of storytelling and understand how the new forms of technology are permitting emerging story forms, along with new patterns of experiencing the world and the stories it has to tell. And a simple example of this is in Tree Hugger. Has anyone experienced Tree Hugger? Yeah, absolutely amazing, right? So Marshmallow Laserfeast, an extraordinary digital arts organisation, they created Tree Hugger. And the viewer steps inside the trunk of a tree and experiences its anatomy from within. You can look around and see this completely different viewpoint of what it's like to be inside a tree. The experience from within that is no less real or truthful from the view that we have when looking upon the tree, but it adds a different layer of reality to our comprehension of what a tree entails. And it's at this deeper level that what emerges is story living. The technology permits a change in the concept of how we understand media and a move from an approach led by storytelling to one that's rooted in experience. Story living is a distinguishing feature and a new field of study. The concept of the lived story has been the subject of interdisciplinary research around cultures and experiences, looking at how we can bring about transformations in understanding around different disciplines. It's also something that's been catching on within industry publications. Since 2017, industry has been defining immersive storytelling as story living. Aside from the practice of immersive media, it's growing as terminology within cultural and commercial circles. Oh, I was going to get back there. So you've got the John saying that brands need to do more than just tell a story, they need to live them. It's that idea that we're now a culture of interactivity and we're a culture that's focused on experience. Camille Colucci, who's head of the Void, a huge immersive studio, says what we're moving into in this new world of story living, we're creating spaces and worlds where people have the chance to live out their own stories within a framework that we design. Matthieu and Bauman argue that the distinctive nature of story living is when, in virtual reality from the story, is when the audience's living stories are being told as opposed to being told it. Through an approach of story living, it expands perspectives, and the audience are left with a powerful emotional experience. It's one of my experiences, it's a random post-Brexit thing, which was set in Western voted in exactly the same proportions as the UK for Brexit. So the whole experience is reminiscent of British culture. And it evokes an emotional response to the country that's divided post-Brexit. There isn't a set narrative, there isn't a directed narrative. It's about the exploration of the place. It's about the exploration of the space, understanding what's happening in the sound. All the sounds are created obviously from the space, but you get to explore what's going on and identify with the characters that you come across. Also critical to the understanding of story living, where the non-directed narrative allows audiences to take away different experiences, is Walser's idea of the space maker. So Walser argued that we need to think of ourselves as magicians. I always think that's a really exciting way to kind of define yourself. I am a magician, I'm creating these realities. We wanted you to think of yourself as a magician that creates a cyberspace where different realities can emerge. So within this film was one of the ones I had shot in Hong Kong, where I was kind of exploring those ideas of place and space. And I was capturing this environment and the people that were in there, and different narratives were emerging. So everybody that's watched that experience has come away with a different narrative. It's not directed, I'm setting up an environment and I'm letting different realities emerge. The audience developed those different narrative ideas around the juxtaposition of cultures, how communities have formed and merged, and that's a direct response to being able to create a space for living and experience. It's in all these images that follow, where you can see evidence of that, how I embed it into practice. The vast, diverse, that's really badly done. That's a screenshot quickly last night. The vast and diverse environments that are portrayed, open to a number of different interpretations, and the reality that's formed by the audience is one that develops from their own experience. That's a bit better. So that's a ghost town in Texas that's just been left like that. You can see where the image would be wrapped around if it was in a headset. Fascinating place. A ghost town in Texas, just off the Route 66. But you see that environment filled, you see the vastness of the secluded environment. You can see how in that moment you are exploring and coming up with your own ideas of what happens. We experience things in different ways. So that's why we cannot direct a narrative if we're focusing on an experiential medium. Despite appearing deserted, it's realities that emerge on how places have changed. Questions around whether it's always been like this, or whether it's a reflection on a changing time. The experience all depends on the audience's understanding from the experience as a whole. So identifying story living as critical to presence within immersive media builds on those ideas that were presented to us by Heidegger, McLuhan and Hume, influencing phenomenological thought within new technology. Coined and picked it up in the 90s, connecting those ideas, the new realities and worlds unfold within virtual reality. By taking this approach, we value the technology in a new way. It's not bound or limited by previous constraints of what it is. And I really like the idea, as much as I like the magician line, I like the idea that using VR is not operating puppets. I really like that idea that we're not constrained. We're not constraining the audience by strings, that we can achieve something other than entertainment. Just because it's an experience you might put on in a headset doesn't mean it has to just be entertainment. Puppets can change identity and become the people operating that. And through recognising the differences, the point argues, we can discover Heidegger's disclosure and find new metaphors within the technology. His application is focused on VR within the early 90s. I don't tend to do computer-generated worlds. I tend to use film to create experiences, and there might be some questions on that afterwards. But applying it within broad immersive media, we can see those new practices emerging that are not bound by established restrictions or practices. And this is really evident when you start doing non-directed narratives. It's a bit like the interactive docs movement that's been huge out down in Bristol, where you have that freedom within the narrative. The audience is responsible for their experience, not within the constraints of the technology and the worlds created for them to explore. Mathieu did a big report for Google 2 years ago, where he wrote about story living. So it's when the user embodies a virtual character, explores the space and makes sense of their own experience. If we go back to one of the original questions I posed from Heim's seminal work on metaphysics of virtual reality in 1994, the question, what is the essence of the technology, the inner spirit, the cultural motor, we can start seeing the technology broadly to embrace the concept of immersive media. The answer lies within story living, realised when we feel presence in the virtual experience. And it's a presence that gains the deeper understanding and new perspectives that is the essence of virtual reality. And this is what Hein refers to as the cultural motor that propels the technology. So to sum up, the aim today is to introduce our concept of story living, what I argue is the defining form of immersive media. And this is achieved when we get a sense of presence. I define presence as being an essential component of immersive media, something distinct that distinguishes it from other media forms. We have to continue to take on that playful, explorative approach to understanding the potentiality of the medium, not relying solely on virtual reality, but also the influence of augmented reality and holograms to explore ideas of presence and interactions with different technological forms. In early studies on VR, Mental and Texalia encourage the use of VR as a form of art, where artists through simulation will merge together all art forms into something new. Virtual reality, or immersive media, is about experience. It is an experiential media. And this is why we need an approach that isn't about telling someone something. The relationship changes, we live the experience, therefore it's story living that's key to define the practice. As a warning, I end up with another fangirl moment to Dani. I have to start and end with him every time. And a warning to not lose yourself in the thrill of the content. And the question that remains prominent at the end of this is what happened to the dream of improvising reality, shared lucid dreaming. I mean, what's the point of just making a flashier type of movie or video game? Thank you. He's a great guy. What's his name? Dani. He wrote You Are Not a Gadget, Throw Away Your Social Media, Dawn of the New Everything.
You're going to write his Amazon page.
Yeah, I think he's an incredible mind.
He was also in The Grateful Dead.
Hmm?
He was also a songwriter for The Grateful Dead.
Yeah, he plays like 200 musical instruments. He's a genius.
So thank you very much. I imagine there are an awful lot of questions. If anyone want to kick off, yes.
I have a question about marks. Okay, so why is it a good thing to fall completely into immersive virtual reality and thus erase the means of production? Why, when, we have this early 20th century Brechtian intervention in precisely this idea that you shouldn't be so defamiliarized that you lose sight of the labor politics involved. I was drawn to that example you had of the Brexit town, and it was like, well, this sort of isn't political, it's like, it's about this town where there was this total split, but of course that is political, it's a centrist politics, right? So how does your work problematize that, or how are you thinking about the politics that are of course going to be in any virtual reality?
Yeah, absolutely. And the politics and the ideas of using technology in that way always concerns me when you think about what it can do to the mind. And I don't think there's enough it's not really an answer to your question, I will come back to it, but it's something that I always think about with the brain hacking ability. And when you look at subliminal messages in regular flat advertising, and then if you do that kind of thing in a headset and you're naturally more immersed in it, what impact does that have? That's not an answer to your question, but that really concerns me. And I do worry about if technology in the wrong hands and concerns around what might be produced and how that might be consumed. I don't know whether it is a good thing to be completely immersed and to lose yourself in that kind of world, but I think it's a great opportunity. And I think there's pros and cons to that. It's a difficult one, and I'm not sure I really know the answer to it. But
Can
it's
I just
something.
point outrageous here and actually just say, I've never done this before as a caveat. I've actually written a paper that answers your question. I'm translating it about cities and games and Marx's kind of perspective on consumption. So that can answer that very challenging question.
Thank you.
So my name is Emma, but come and find me.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm really sorry about
So
that.
I will answer that question by referring you to Emma, who has written an incredible paper on exactly that subject, and it will be shared later. Thanks.
Something else? Please.
Thank you. I just wondered, in one of the last quotes it mentions story living, and you defined it in terms of taking on a character. Do you think you need to take on a character to live that
No.
experience?
I don't think you need to, on the basis that most of my work you don't. And there's no difference to the sense of presence. So no. I think it can have interesting results when you do. And there's been some great work out of Stanford from the Human Interaction Lab, where changing identities, and Mel Slater's done a lot on this as well, where you can look in a mirror in a headset and change your identity to become a woman and understand what it's like to be a female in the workplace, or you can understand what it's like to be homeless. So there's certainly a lot of embodying characters to help understand different perspectives, which I think is a really good thing. I don't think it's necessary for story living, and how I always think of it, if I'm filming something, the camera is that person, so you are that person. In a headset, I know that this is from my point of view and from my perspective looking around, and I am the camera. So I don't think it's necessary. I don't need to look down and see blue hands to know that my hands are there. And the technology that I deal with isn't good enough yet. I don't like feeling like a cartoon. I prefer to just accept, okay, I can't see my body, but in 30 seconds I've lost that and I don't need it. So I think it can be interesting and it can help understandings, but I don't think it's necessary.
It felt like you encapsulated it when you talked about inhabiting a point of view. That's what it is, it's inhabiting a point of view.
Yeah, and I talk a lot around the really flawed notion of empathy, and VR is an empathy machine, and I don't like it. And I struggle with that idea of, I can put on a headset and feel like I'm a refugee and I'm struggling, and so no, you can't. You can only feel like it's for you and your westernised privilege to understand what it's like to be a refugee. You don't have that historical context to really understand it. Just putting on a headset and pretending that you're there isn't going to give you that context at all. So I think that's a really flawed idea. But I get shouted at up.
I think that's a wonderful place to answer. Thank you very much.
So yeah, I'll just try and sort of smash this out in 15 minutes anyway. So basically, this is kind of a little bit of a work in progress. It started off as some research I was doing on sort of side research on cities, and I ended up on roadblocks, which I'll explain in a moment, but the research hasn't progressed quite as I imagined because I was hoping to play with my niece and her friends in Roblox, and it turns out that actually children are really disagreeable. So most of the time it was just me by myself in Roblox, which is slightly tricky because it's mostly full of children, and also you just don't learn much if you're not playing with people, right? So I needed networks of people playing with, and adults don't enjoy it. So just as a kind of caveat, this is a work in progress. Okay. So part of what I'm interested in doing, building on, I think quite a lot of people will be talking about sort of really specific examples, things they've worked on. So I'm sort of a little bit more on the theory of space and place and landscape in terms of digital media. So I have sort of identified that typically, and I am generalising here, there are two common ways to consider space and place in digital media. So one sort of default is the idea of an online space, so sort of the idea of a cyberspace, involving communities and groups of individuals, network screens and hardware, and it's sort of broadly this kind of idea started off with chat rooms and you progress from there. And the other is the digital virtual space, so something that's fictional or imagined, so typically 3D game worlds, sometimes narratives, the ideas of sort of diegetical narrative space of games, right? So there's this generalization that happens. And I'm sort of trying to problematize this. I think increasingly they're kind of interlinked. There's a lot of blurring between the two. And so when you start to look at things like This is Harry Potter Wizards Unite, Pokemon Go, that kind of stuff. You increasingly get a blur between kind of a virtual community and a virtual space. And I'm also interested in things like speculative 3D models for planned future developments and that kind of thing as well. So I think these really merge these two ideas together. So if we're thinking about definitions of space and place, it straight away gets quite complicated. So, can we have digital places? And we have a lot of arguments in favour of both. It's not fundamentally physically real, therefore it's not a place. And then also the question of how is space, including, Lefebvrean or Marxist notions of production and consumption and experience, impacted by digital media? And is this impact in some way different from, say, the impacts of capitalism more broadly or not? So Doreen Massey clearly understood the digital world to be spatial. So, it's embedded in real material practices, and she was clear that the world of physical space and the world of electronically mediated connection do not exist as somehow separate layers. The virtual world, and that's her own sort of inverted commas as well there, this virtual world depends on and further configures the multiplicities of physical space. So if we're looking for a theorisation of space, Doreen Massey, not going to argue with her, says, well, look, it's a kind of configuration that works within the social space and the physical space that we already have. So we sort of end up straight away with this problem, which I would say is maybe a fake problem, of the virtual and the real. And I really love to go back to Svetlana Boym's work from The Future of Nostalgia, where she was really very critical early on of this idea of cyberspace. So she says, internet patriots would claim that cyberspace unfolds in another dimension, beyond the rules of existential mathematics and the dialectic of memory and forgetting. Cyberspace makes the bric-a-brac of nostalgia available in digital form, appearing more desirable than the real artefacts. And there's a lot of other things that she sort of says about this. I don't have time to expand. If you haven't looked at Future of Nostalgia, I really recommend having a look at that. But key amongst it, if I can get to my slide, is that she sort of starts to talk about things like Bergson's theory of consciousness. She talks about hypertext, and she basically says that the new media redefines the architecture of space with a superhighway, villages and chat rooms, but then goes on to say, but none of it's particularly new, actually. These are variations of the spaces that we have. So these metaphors for the novelty of space are really just, ways of expressing capitalist desire. And she was sort of talking about this in the 90s. And I've just got a little picture here from an AR game called Wayfinder Live, which I don't really have time to unpack. So then I think we immediately get to this question, which may have been what was posed at the end of the last session, or the last paper as well with the questions, that actually, are we really getting digital places, spaces, or is this just about consumption? So Julian Stalabras actually wrote about games and said, was really critical about the potential for games as being kinds of spaces and being complex, saying that really they were just open to commodification. So he says, like cast metal sculptures, virtual objects are hollow. Code like air fills their voids, their surfaces being a reflective chrome. They are mirror images of undifferentiated, mass-produced consumer goods. Games obsequiously reflect the operation of consumer capital being based on exchange, a trading of money, munitions or energy, the shuttling back and forth of goods and blows. And I think what's interesting about this is, on one hand, it problematises the idea that you could have what we might call an authentic or genuine place, but at the same time, when you think about the production of place and space, it also hints towards this kind of all-consuming drive of capitalism in particular to overtake all space and place and experience anyway, right? So these might actually be mutually constituted. And so we can start to talk about, on one hand, I'm interested in the description of space and place in games through navigation. I think that's a really important definition if you're trying to think about how is something maybe a place, how is something a space. Navigation is a key part of that. But also I think it's a bit lazy of me, but it's quite straightforward to actually say, yeah, it's a place because it's produced, according to Henri Lefebvre, abstract space is a representation of space, though shallow. It contains specific imaginary elements, fantasy images, symbols which appear to arise from something else, but such representations find their authority and prescriptive power in and through space that underpins them and makes them effective. So he sort of says that yes, we have lived material spaces, but they are constituted from kind of underlying symbolic prescriptions of space. So I'm actually going to skip this bit because I'm running out of time, but basically this is an argument that we need to understand representation, which follows on from Lefebvre. And then I think the other thing that's quite important before we get onto the Roblox example is to think about landscape as well. So that landscape is this way of kind of situating people within the environment. It's used very neatly in a lot of games as almost a shortcut to kind of situate people within specific locations, particularly if you want to say, okay, I'm in this particular city. So Gordon-Hilaire kind of contrasts the simulation of space with the representation of landscape. So he sort of says that navigable space is necessarily simulated space. But I think we need to remember to go back to some of the landscape theory that Sharon Zukin actually says that landscape itself stretches the imagination. It's more than a descriptor for the physical setting, topography or scenery. It also refers to the ensemble of material and social practice and their symbolic representation. So again, we're kind of going back to the idea from Lefebvre as well, and the slide that I skipped, that representational kind of elements do structure space and place and experiences of space and place. And I'm quite willing to have a fight about that with anyone who wants to. I'm quite happy. So Roblox is this really strange, has anyone played Roblox in any great detail? It's really weird. So basically it's an online gaming and social media platform, but it's really for kids, so most of the people on there are kind of under 14. And if you go in, it's a series of places that you can kind of log into, and a lot of it's kind of role-playing games with various kinds of structures, and I mean role-playing games in the way that kids in the playground say they're going to play Families, or they're going to play Let's Cook, or whatever, these kinds of games. And it's huge, it's growing really quickly, so in less than a year it went from 80 to 90 million active users in the last sort of 18 months. It's still going up. And so it does a lot of different things, so it's kind of a social network, it's kind of a space for games, but it's also, a lot of kids logging into the same location all the time and running around. So there are playgrounds, for example, where kids will log on every day and hang out together in these playgrounds. It's a really weird environment. And if you're interested, this is the spiel that they have about their own software. So then they have these things that are places, so you can kind of see Jailbreak, Mad City, Dungeon Quest, so they're kind of games, but they're also kind of locations. They also provide a studio to design and model content, which is kind of their shtick, that people can go in and make their own places. So Bloxburg is a user-generated place, right, in their own language. So basically my early observations on this are that Roblox, they use abstract representations of place and landscape through symbols to produce a kind of social space. This is the argument that I would make. It is highly capitalist, so you can see here, you need 399 more Robux before you can do whatever it is that I was trying to do there. It amalgamates cyberspace and virtual space, I would say, and it's also really social and community oriented, so you get the same users logging into the same places. And it has really strong links to urban and city design, which I'll talk about for a couple of minutes towards the end, particularly in the way that places, so games, worlds, bases, all of these locations that are built by users and them are actually represented as part of cities. So there are often these very urban kind of themes, and users as citizens of the urban or suburban space of Robloxia. So this is a user-generated image of this place that is Robloxia, that is also a place that you can go to, and there's an infinitude of Robloxia imagined places that users have put together that sort of imagine this city that you might all be living in. So that's kind of, I'll come back to Roblox in a minute. I sort of wanted to talk a bit about AR and VR, but I don't have a lot of time for that. And also this is more of a history of where Roblox kind of came from as well. So some of this stuff is really old. Arup's been doing sort of 3D modelling, for example, to understand things like passenger movements through train stations, and a lot of this is going on at the same time as Roblox. And what sort of happened is that you now have this kind of conversion between architectural modelling and games, which I think most of you would probably be familiar with. I've just got a kind of neat quote here from a guy from Blockworks. So that's the V&A model that Blockworks made, but they basically go into Minecraft and do architectural models in Minecraft, and they're all architects. So the guy who runs that says, whilst the architects of today grew up playing with Lego, I've no doubt the next generation will have played Minecraft. People have to stop thinking of it as a game. It's a CAD tool. And as such, it's the most widely used one in the world. And they're sort of looking to bridge the gaps between design and reality, which I'm like, well, the point of design is that it produces reality, I would have thought. But anyway, I don't have time time to go through this sort of participatory planning stuff, but if you're interested and you don't already know, just have a look at the MIT Media Lab stuff. So they do a lot of interactive design using hybrid reality labs to actually produce urban spaces. So the most probably well-known one was that they helped to design refugee housing in Hamburg in 2016, and that's a picture of the kind of half material, half virtual that they use. So just to finish up, I wanted to kind of point out though that a lot of the hype around this digital AR, VR kind of stuff is not new, and it is hype. And I would point to the work of Meldawish, Dagan and Rose, who worked on CGI in Doha and said that CGI is not simply then the product of certain social conditions but constitute an inscription of individual and collective identities, knowledge and values, allow for conscription of actors in common venture, and lead to the objectification of a project in real life. In that sense, CGI, so computer-generated images, are not only representations but actually have agency and become embedded in the construction of space, place and social life, which I feel like should seem fairly logical, but we're still here having these discussions. It's not just me, it's other people. And I would also want to quickly point out that a lot of this stuff we do still need to be skeptical of. So there's this hilarious augmented reality app from Villeroy and Bosch where you can augmented reality your bathroom. However, I would point out that yes, you download the app, and then the next step is to download the AR marker and print it, and then stick it up in your bathroom. So sort of like, to what extent is this really a digital kind of experience? So we really need to be skeptical on a lot of this stuff. It's done kind of for the buzz, I think. So to conclude, and these are just wild conclusions that I'm making, partly as well so that people can disagree with me. So space, place and associated landscapes and material encounters exist in digital media. I'm just saying they do, right? And they generate new senses of space and place beyond the digital. And we know that they're used as tools for this purpose. That's kind of the point of someone like MIT working on these digital hybrid reality labs. Representation against perhaps popular, particularly geographical ideas is a key aspect of the capacity of digital media to actually produce space in the Lefebvrean sense. So particularly when we're thinking about consumption and things like that, and maybe in Marx's perspective, any separation of cyberspace communities, virtual spaces or worlds, and material or, quote, real space is difficult to maintain in the face of hybrid media and hybrid social worlds. So Roblox really troubles this idea because it's both a virtual sort of space and a cyberspace, all sorts of other stuff, and also none of these claims are new. So Boyne, Massey and Melhuish, lots of others have actually had this argument in various ways before, but somehow we always come back to this debate. We can't kind of decide, is the virtual, real or not? Like, we just need to make this decision and say, well, it's much more complicated than that. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you for that, Emma. What we're going to do is just go through the papers one after the other and then have as much time as we've got left at the end for questions.
Morning everyone. I have to make an apology first of all for Michał. Can't make it. His son's not very well unfortunately, so he couldn't come over from Poland. This is a shame because we're talking about place building in VR and in VR games, and Michał's a geographer and I'm a charlatan. So I'm a media theorist who's hung around geography for a long, long time pretending to know what he's talking about. Michał couldn't have all the reading stuff, unfortunately. He stuck with me instead. This is a very, very basic outline of some ideas we were pulling together when I spent some time with Michał in April on an Erasmus Plus exchange in University. As we were sitting having a coffee and a cigarette one day outside the building, Michał was asking me about what video games I play. I was reading off this endless list of things I used to distract myself from the horrific everyday life that I have as a senior lecturer at Swansea University. And we got onto VR games, and I sort of started reading off some of the games that I've actually played, and then we said, okay, so you've got two categories of games. There were games that were made for VR and games that weren't made for VR. What do you find you prefer? And I thought about about this question previously and not really given it a huge amount of thought, and we've sort of dug into why I've got a real aversion now towards games that have been ported over to virtual reality. In my perspective, and from my experience of playing them, there's a very simple reason why I don't like these games, and it's because they make me sick. They make me feel like I'm going to vomit after about 10 minutes of playing them, which is not great. I've been using VR on virtually a daily basis now for 4 years, so I don't get the nausea effect anymore for most things. But a lot of these in particular, which I've just been playing before Borderlands 2, and Borderlands 2 is one of my favourite video games. The Borderlands 2 VR game, I can't do for more than 5 minutes without feeling so nauseous that I have to stand outside. I live on the first floor balcony, so standing outside is a real effort for me, because if I go too far then I'm going to die. So we got to this sort of idea here, and I'd already kind of touched upon it in the book I wrote last year, The Re-Emergence of Virtual Reality, that there's built-for VR games which combine all the elements of VR in order to make a gaming experience. And now we've got ported VR games, which are actually very popular, and you can imagine why from a commercial perspective. These are games that people have already played, already familiar with, and are moved over into a VR environment, and using the headset rather than using the traditional gaming interface that they've been built for, and there's something really, really problematic about it. But to go beyond just making me feel physically uncomfortable, we wanted to unpick, okay, is there any way we can theorise why there's this big difference between the two? What is the qualitative difference between playing these games, built for VR games and VR ports? Where theoretically can we start to draw a line between these two things? So, using Michał's knowledge rather than mine, there are videos here, but I'm going to skip over them because time is limited. Ported video games use the familiar geographical cues to build up a sense of place in the game. And there's a long history of literature about this in the video game canon, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much now. But wayfinding and navigation in these ported games is really traditionally how we do this in video games anyway. That, for me, is why I get the nausea factor. I'm being asked to navigate a space in a way that doesn't fit with the medium that I'm actually using at that point in time, which is the VR headset. I am not using my television screen as a navigational tool in the game space at this point. I'm actually within the game space in this limited sense if you're using the PSVR. Much more sense in like the Oculus Quest, which I brought along today if anyone wants to try. So these ported VR games, they don't give any affordances for virtual reality. They are just a translation of the original game into virtual reality. There's no manipulation of the mechanics in order to make some affordances for this new medium. The built-for VR games deal with embodiment in a very, very different way. So embodiment actually becomes the mechanism for the creation of a sense of space in a VR game in that sense. So you move just beyond virtual representations and shift the relationality of the player. In ported games, it's an embodiment relation. In built-for VR games, what we say, there is a hermeneutic relation to the game. So we move, and this is where I'm borrowing from Dani here, the great post-phenomenologist, and I wish he'd used a different term for this, because he talks about embodiment relations, and I'm talking about embodiment as a hermeneutic relation. So embodiment relation actually doesn't mean embodiment in this sense, it means a mediation of the embodied experience. So, Michał got to thinking, which is great, because finally I've got someone who will do the thinking for me. This is a perfect relationship as far as I'm concerned. What is it about the ported games that is really problematic in terms of the embodiment relation that we have with the game? There's no body or embodiment considered in the design of those spaces. If you're playing a ported over game like here we've got Doom VR, although it's a first-person shooter, it is not an embodied experience when you're playing it on a console. You are remote from it, you are distanced from it. It is a mediated experience. you are not being asked to embody that. Now you may gain a feeling of embodiment, but it is always distant from. So priority in these kind of experiences is given to the architecture of the game in terms of space, rather than the phenomenological experience of the game for the user. This is Andrew Reinhardt talking specifically about Skyrim VR in this case, but ports over nicely to a number of different things. And this lack of embodiment, this non-consideration of embodiment as a core principle of the VR experience, according to Eric Champion, means that we get a lack of virtual place. So when I'm in, say, Doom VR, and Doom VR is another sort of vomit comic of a game, there is no consideration in the design of this towards creating a sense of virtual placehood in the user. It is a ported over version of the original Doom game. It's fun, except the controls don't work and you get killed really, really quickly. But another problematic aspect of these ported games is that they tend to break immersion very, very easily, very, very quickly, because the imperfect representations of places and objects within them, and this porting over means that the visual fidelity of these games is really, really poor. And that's something actually that comes out mostly in the VR community itself. The idea that games that aim for high realism in particular are really, really problematic when we transport them over to virtual reality. We sort of descend into the uncanny valley at that point. And a lot of games at the moment that are being worked on as ports over to VR do aim for high levels of realism, and that is not ideal. Instead, we need to take the edge off the realism a little if we're going to put them into virtual reality. So there's another aspect here of why these don't work. Built for virtual reality games, we've got to think, okay, so we've identified some problems here with these type of games. Okay, what works? What is different with these? And what we wanted to put forward that there's sort of unreal modes of movement that help with immersion. Instead of looking at what video games do, is just try and build a mechanism and an engine to move in a particular environment and to explore that environment. And there are customs, and there's a whole discourse and a discursive formation around how that's done in video games. The games that work in virtual reality, and I know there's an irony here with using Superhot as the picture, because that actually wasn't a VR game, it was a game in a VR game. But looking to utilise how the body can be moved in VR in different ways, in more effective ways, in a built-for virtual reality experience, leads to a qualitatively different experience of gaming in these things. And for example, I'm sure most, well, I don't know, have most people played Beat Saber? It seems to be the most. No? Got it loaded on the Quest headset for you. Robo Recall is a great one now with the teleporting system in Robo Recall. It's not realistic in terms of movement, but it actually helps with the immersion in the experience in Robo Recall. And Superhot, and this relation of space and time with movement in it, makes movement a critically important part of the experience, to the extent to which after 5 minutes of playing it you stop realising how you're moving. And the movement itself will draw, so Sarah to borrow from Heidegger and the draw, right? Once that withdraws some circumspection, you can fairly be sure that you're immersed in that experience. So, as I said, we based a lot of this around Dani, and what we wanted to argue is that in these built-for VR games, place is embodied in a multi-stable manner. The experience of space is situated, embodied, specific, and fully signifying when these things work properly. And therefore we've got a sense of embodiment in a particular experiential world. Now, what I should have drawn real close attention to is the word specific. What that means, as far as I'm concerned with this, is that in order to achieve high levels of immersion or presence, the design of motion and therefore worldhood in that experience will be individualized to the particular game. To copy over game mechanics and endlessly reuse the same mechanics over and over again is going to be problematic unless you are reproducing the same thing over and over again, which is going to be problematic for you in a commercial sense rather than in an experiential sense. So really, the situated, embodied, specific and fully signifying, these are things which are not necessarily achieved by porting games over into VR. They are achieved from building VR building VR games from the ground up for the specific headset, the technology being used, etc. And as I said, where are we getting this from? And this is from a number of readings of Dani's work. This really is about the ported VR games and what he says about the embodiment relation that we have. And when Dani is talking about relations, he's talking about how we see the world and how we experience the world through our use of technology, of specific technologies. So, in terms of VR here, if we're using ported over games, we get an embodiment relation. We see the world as it's presented to us through the technology itself, and the headset becomes the mediator for that. Embodiment, therefore, is limited by the scope of the program and the architecture that has been put into it. The mediation of the experience really just comes through the headset, the way you use it. We are not part of the world, it is a mediated experience for us, and that's what I call an embodiment relation to technology. What we want to argue is when VR's done right, and it can be done wrong, of course, and frequently is done very, very poorly, but when it is done right, and one of my favourites, this is being recorded, isn't it? I have issues with work, but I play Job Simulator for fun, so there's something wrong going on there, right? So, a hermeneutic relation is an understanding of the experiential world that comes through an engagement with the technology, not just being presented with the world through the technology, but engagement with in particular ways. So touch, sound, movement, vision, rather than the mediation of embodiment relations, a hermeneutic circle of experience is formed if these things are done correctly. All embodied relations become withdrawn as we experience things. We become part of the experience rather than considering what elements and what things go into that experience. And that's what, if that happens, that's when we know we're in a hermeneutic relationship with a particular form of technology, a particular medium. It's liberally borrowing from Immersive. Okay, so, as I said, we're kind of at the beginning of something here, and we have just been kicking these ideas around, and I've put a couple of bids in to start exploring these ideas more. But really our starting point here is, embodiment and embodiment relation is limited by the scope and design of experience. Hermeneutic relations of embodiment is part of a series of experiential relations, and these, at the moment, fit the two sort of different types of VR game experience that we see. Although, I will add that I think perhaps there's a third sort of hybrid form emerging between the two as well. But there's hardly anything that fits in at the moment, so I'm not going to talk about it. That's the work that we reference for this. I'll take my leave. I'll have questions later.
Hi, I'm Vicky. I'm a PhD student here. I'm actually in the Department of English Literature, but again, I float the interdisciplinary lines. So yeah, today I'm sort of drawing stuff out of my own PhD research into geographies of feeling, and today I'll be talking about challenging the discourses of embodiment space and experiential horizons in virtual reality. And by that I kind of mean the prolific representations of VR, the kind of advertising material we get access to, what kind of experiences these shape, and the expectations they produce, and how they might not necessarily be all too realistic. So, as I said, I'm not a geographer, but I am interested in the intricacies of interacting with virtual environments, the way it feels to be present or not quite present within a virtual simulation and the real world simultaneously, and the ways embodiment plays into this as well. So, let's draw it off. So, as well as being interested in the spatial representations of VR, I'm interested in the spatial experiencing of VR as well, and I'll also be drawing from phenomenology, which I know has been a big up this morning, which is great. So I want to think about how virtual space is experienced phenomenologically, and how that might provide an alternative to these sort of more potent representations we're getting that necessarily can't capture these sort of real-time experiences. And in so doing, I want to sort of think about the question of absolute agency in VR that seems to be pushed at us, and sort of challenge that sort of absolute sense of agency. And I think that Geographies of Feeling can capture some of that. So yeah, I'll be thinking about agency and access, and sort of the ways VR feels and how this might be useful. Cool, so I want to suggest that current depictions of VR currently stand at the intersection of these three geographies, the first being natural geographies. So by that I mean that representations of immersion in popular advertising tend to valorise the spatial geography, and in doing so they evade the reference to the hardware. I will come on to some more explicit examples. So you just get a depiction of a natural environment as opposed to, hey, here's a weird headset. The next one I want to suggest is the importance of the domestic geographies in advertising. And this, I want to argue, as opposed to an invasion of the headset, marks an invasion of the domestic space by the virtual environment. We kind of see spaces of domestic walls kind of opening up onto virtual spaces. And finally, bodily geographies. That's where I want to land it. I'm going into that at the end. But this is what I have a problem with in terms of bodily geographies, the kind of valorisation of the user and the body of the user in contemporary advertising to depict sort of very overt emotional and physical responses to the technology in order to kind of sell it. And this creates sort of weird sort of expressions of how it actually feels. So I've put these arrows in to make it all look like a neat narrative, but I think in reality it kind of looks something more like that. So I'm not trying to suggest that all of these geographies are encompassing or that they're all oppositional to one another. Rather I want to think about how they all come into contact for our real-time lived experiences of doing VR. Phenomenology allows for us to break through the popular framings of VR to consider its intimate geographies of feeling. So my work kind of goes between the framings of VR and how it's depicted as frameless, and sort of lands somewhere in the middle when thinking about all these different approaches. So I'm going to turn to affect theory, particularly in relation to digital technology, and I want to argue here the representations of certain geographies in VR advertising do away with some of the more intimate and embodied relationships we have to VR. So I want to sort of retain the importance of subjective experience, and the kind of complex interconnections of embodiment and feeling, and I want to say that the lines between the exterior body and the interior simulation are not neatly contained. Cool, so natural geographies. This is taken from the HTC Vive advertisement from 2017. So it sells it as a whole new reality. It kind of looks like a reality, I know. But it's sort of this framing of a place where anyone has a chance to make their mark. Little, if any, focus is given to the hardware itself. Rather, attention is paid to the potential VR users who seek to experience the supposed new reality this technology makes possible. Such a new reality, it is suggested, removes the individual from the constraints of any given social political reality, so that anyone is able to make their mark. Again, there's no reference to the headset, and so this is sort of promoting access as a mode of making the headset disappear. This is saying it's that accessible that you technically feel like you're in the real world. From my experience, that's not always the case. Domestic geographies. So again, these are taken from HTC Vive advertisements, PSVR advertisements, and the Oculus Rift. The HTC, which we can see on a couple of these, in fact, yeah, the bottom one, uses room scale tracking, cameras set up in the four corners of the room, so this really plays on the sort of spatial experiencing of VR. And one of the ways they mark this sort of merging of the real and the virtual is by sort of opening this space, which is typically a westernised domestic space, very cushy and snazzy as well, which seems to be a thing, And it's completely sort of opened up like a portal, and sort of that domestic space, it sort of marks an invasion by the virtual. So yeah, we see a group of people sat on the sofa, seemingly under the sea. So this kind of, again, marks a different kind of access, which I think raises important questions about not only the access we have to the virtual environment, but actually the access we give to this technology into the domestic space. And I know there's sort of a lot of considerations, particularly with Oculus, about the kinds of data that they're using and collecting, particularly when the headsets have the capacity to sort of get data about your domestic space. So there's a kind of reverse multi-directional access at play here that I think this can sort of benefit from. Finally, bodily geographies. So this kind of, again, evades any sense of materiality. We see in the PSVR advertisement that the headset kind of floats away into pixelated bits. And again, VR's immersive potential is defined through its complete effacement of the material hardware. And again, as people probably know, Bolster and Grusin discussed this in Remediation as the kind of logic of transparency, whereby the perfect interface enables the sensation of having fallen through the hardware interface into the world of computer graphics. But in this instance, the body becomes central. And I think that this does have some effective charge in that it suggests that the user can feel as though they would feel in the real world around them. But I think that to imply that VR equates to the everyday experiences of the world is limiting in some respects. And I think that from my own experience and from talking about it with others, VR doesn't always work seamlessly with everyone. In a lot of ways it presumes able-bodiedness. There are studies that suggest that the headsets are fit for male heads and not necessarily cater for females, smaller heads, and for different types of hair. This sort of material factor is really important, and I think that these kind of representations do away with some of that. And I think that immersion can sometimes mask these affective intricacies. In thinking about a phenomenology of affect, it might allow for the interrogation of the processes and movements between one space and another. So I kind of want to go into that now. I have problems with this, as I've said, because I think it uses the user as a spectacle, and rather than the game or application being the spectacle, the user's body and sort of response to the environment takes with it. So I want to quickly run through some ideas that I've been thinking about in terms of trying to map a geography of feeling, or sort of thinking about how we might approach, again from a theoretical standpoint, VR from the realm of affect theory. So I want to think about three different points, and the first sector or sort of idea I'm thinking is ecologies of affect. So I've cited Davidson et al. Here. So ecologies of affect might be to do with the way the subject comes into contact with the place she is in through a set of virtual affects, which form part of the production of that space. So again, I think that's a really important part of the virtual reality experience, is this sense that the body is in some way also contributing to the creation of that space. So Davidson et al.'s work thinks about desire, nostalgia and memory in a particular place, and how sort of affect and embodiment factor into those feelings, their tones, their moods, and I think again we can really benefit from thinking about those things when we're interacting with VR. What are the kinds of moods and feelings and desires? What are these sort of very effective parts of being in VR? Bodily horizons. Sarah Ahmed. I'm taking in by bodily horizons because I think, as opposed to the advertising, which is very much centred on this limitless potential that everyone has, I like this mode of thought in that it says, hey, like, limitations are a useful part of experience, let's think about limitations and what they can tell us about our experiences. Sarah Ahmed's work on queer phenomenology, which is what I've cited here, places issues of access at its core. So Ahmed takes the idea of giveness, that idea that the world reaches out to us and receives from us through our interactions with it, thinks about the ways orientation affects access to the world. So aligning phenomenology in queer studies, Ahmed considers the ways phenomenology is always inherently entangled in social, political and cultural contexts, to the degree that access to certain things is dictated by lived experience. Ahmed refers to heteronormativity as a straight way of seeing, an orientation towards the world which enables the most access. It's the path most trodden. And spaces that enact certain privilege, where orientation differs to the sketched horizons of heteronormativity, as Ahmed says, when this kind of comes into contact, that action is blocked. So she talks about queer moments as that sort of lack of extension into phenomenal space. And she talked about body horizons, so the body horizon shows the line that bodies can reach toward, what is reachable, by also marking what they cannot reach. The horizon marks the edge of what can be reached by the body. The body becomes present as a body, with surfaces and boundaries in the showing of the limits of what it can do. So a horizon marks a space in which bodies can access things. When reaching the limits of interaction within a space, Ahmed notes that the body's embodiedness and embeddedness becomes more present. Its contours are brought to the surface. And I think in terms of immersion, this could be a really useful way of thinking about it. In assuming this absolute access. And immersion has become this kind of prolific expectation of VR. And as a consequence, there is a collective failure to unpick the intricacies of what immersion means and how users inevitably play a part in it. To acknowledge how VR feels is to challenge the idea that immersion is inherently good or ethically devoid. It enables awareness that proximity and movement are felt, and that sometimes these factors can implicate compromised senses of agency, which developers and audiences alike need to be more aware of. So let's think more about access, where it falters and for whom. And finally, I've been taken in by Susan Hazel's work, which is fantastic for anyone interested in VR. She's produced some really great work recently about affect and VR. So for Kozul, a phenomenology of affect is conceptualised through sort of somatic embodiment or somatism, and she uses this as a mode of accessing the body as a synergy of processes. So she thinks about the body's interaction with non-human and objects, others as well. So Kozul actually uses this mode of access to think about the feelings VR produces, claiming that VR is able to produce what she calls a shimmer, a mixture of strangeness and delight where expectations do not map directly onto perceptual flow and create a small rupture. So again, there's this idea that feelings can actually go against the expectations that these very specific framings of VR produce, and there's good use of that because I think when you try VR, it's different to how you can ever expect. I think that's that. But just to conclude, I want to sum up my ideas at the moment. So I want to suggest that current advertisements and discourses around VR fail to capture the intimacies and intricacies of access and agency that are implicated in the experiences of VR technology. So that is to say that the sort of embodied and effective dimensions of our VR experiences are as important as the kind of predominant discourses that we get and the representations of those experiences. Let's think about our lived experiences on this. Phenomenology might allow for the consideration of geographies of feeling in order to critically interpret and evaluate experiences. So again, I think that the kind of effective dimensions of VR can open up this kind of critical interpretation of VR that we can't necessarily access otherwise. Stepping into a technology is different for everyone. I'm taking that from the Oculus advertisements, which use Step into Rift. From experience of using the VR with students, some of them don't want to enter VR in a public group. It's not something that they want to do. They don't like the idea that they're in a room full of people watching them and they can't see them there's all these sort of different things that arise when you're using VR in the real time that you don't expect otherwise. And I think, again, developers and users and practitioners of VR need to be more aware of this and sort of think about these ethical questions. And finally, challenging absolute access is a mode of rethinking immersion. So I want to think about all the ways VR might not be accessible and how those are also important. Not necessarily to do away with immersion, but just to think about it, break it down a little bit, because it tends to be this sort of big word that has lots of different dimensions to it. Let's break it down and bring it back. That's me, thank you. Just some plugging of open access stuff that I wrote. But yeah, thank you very much.
I've actually given this presentation once already at the AEG, so I apologise to those who were there, but I think this is actually going to be a bit of a different presentation to that presentation, partly because I never put very many quotes on my slides anyway, and partly because I want to pick up some of the themes that have sort of arisen throughout this session, partly around this question of modes of production, capitalism, etc. That Emma pulled up this question of the absoluteness of access that you pulled up as well, and this sort of question of what might constitute a natural or otherwise VR experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on. It'll be complete at the end of the year. I'm still trying to get some more archival documents. That's another long story for historians. I think it came more about archival practices. But it's a project that I'm working on. This building, which is Company 1 at Manchester, small, nondescript, boring building that is now home to, I think, health psychology. But this building was purpose-built in 1948 for Alan Turing to house the Ferranti Mark I, which is one of the earliest computers developed in the UK. It's quite funny, if you go to this building right next to the Kilburn building where the Manchester Mark I was being run, and that is a much bigger building, much more impressive. But they made this little building, and these are the original plans from that building, and it's quite interesting when you look at these plans, sort of architects trying to struggle with this idea of what does a computation facility looks like? How do you house computation? What is this kind of architecture? And it's got two stories. The top story, the bottom story is for electronic and magnetic engineering, and the top story has just a couple of different rooms, an operations room, all the maths and engineers. Mr. Turing is specifically outlined this in his office, and on the side here, this is one of the key points I want to talk about, is this office for typist. And so, so Turing's building its rooms in the northeast corner there. And this is the main interest of the building. It's not a particularly interesting building otherwise, except that Alan Turing reportedly spent a bit of time here writing some various instructions to use computer manuals, although he didn't really. He spent most of his time in Oslo, not coming into the university and sending all his letters. So I want to think a little bit about these questions that we've sort of talked about around digitalities and digital technologies, and particularly this ongoing concern I've been thinking about for a while about the use of pronouns, and specifically the pronoun we and you. It's often like when we use virtual reality, when you use virtual reality. The question I always have to this kind of we or you is, well, who specifically are we talking about? Who is this we, this absolute kind of idea? And I think in some ways it might come out as a kind of a criticism that we have to think in more situated ways, but I also think it's an opportunity. And as Anna Woodson was saying 13 years ago now, if we recast the digital as an aesthetic force capable of producing new kinds of sensations and effective responses, you might instead see it as belonging to the activity of imagining. And so when I'm talking about this critique of the we and the you, it's not to say that we shouldn't be using these technologies at all, but that we have to think much more critically about for whom are we using these technologies and how. And every question or every assumption that we make is, I think, in many ways an opportunity lost in terms of how we can be leveraging this kind of technology not to basically service PlayStation, Sony, but instead service society or social relations, politics more generally. And so I'm going to take as a starting point the question of we and you that raised and has been raised over and over again through questions of feminist technoscience and Afrofuturism. So this kind of question of reimagining from different starting points. And this question of vernacular cartographies. And so Gaskins, and Teresa Gaskins, writes, Afrofuturists visualize social imaginary using vernacular cartography, the study and practice of making maps to combine techno-vernacular creativity and aesthetics to build on the premise that cultural systems and data can model communicate spatial information in unique ways. So basically, this kind of thinking is already emerging. It has been emerging for quite a long time. If we think about the cartographic, and I'll make a case here for thinking about cartography. So I'm a cartographer by trade. I did a media degree, then I went into geography and critical cartography. And this question of we and you has actually been already unpacked at length by critical cartography over the past 30 years. It's been this ongoing questioning that that cartography has a universal ambition. It wants to try and describe all places under singular systems. If we think about Cartesian coordinates, the coordinate system, or if we think about lines, or we think about categories, what Foucault would call mathesis and taxonomia. But critical cartographers of the past 30 years have already been critiquing this idea of universal ambition. And that's not to say that maps themselves are bad, but that perhaps the question of universality should not be totalizing. Furthermore, that these universal ambitions have a long bound-up history of colonialism as well as capitalism. And one way we can think about that in terms of VR is that actually many of the systems that we use around VR are based upon cartographic systems. That they're based upon the same kinds of theories and thinking that we engage already with maps. And Farinelli talks about the way in which generally spatial reason for this question of rationalism, which we might understand as universal way of thinking. So Descartes, we know his coordinates, talked about a mathesis universalis, that is the universal mathematics, the idea that the whole world can be expressed as numbers. And similarly, Leibniz, who lots of people refer to going back all the way to affect, when thinking about things like ontology, the sublime, etc., talked about a characteristic universalis, that is the substrate of all matter, and if physicists aren't trying to find that now, I'm not sure what they're doing when this is the base of quantum physics and string theory is trying to find this underlying, underpinning order that can, the whole world can be understood through. And Farinelli, in terms of thinking about how we think spatially, argues that this is the protocol of the cartographical image. I'm not going to go too much into detail about that. Suffice to say that we do see these kinds of these numeric systems that Descartes produced already in digital systems. So this here is just a simple three-dimensional Cartesian plane. So rather than 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 7. I'm not going to bore you too much, because I really want to get onto the more interesting stuff, which is this project that I've been doing. So the project I had was to ask a simple question: could old school ways of thinking about space through architectural planning, measurements, be really easily cut up and brought into contemporary ways of thinking about spatial planning and architecture in SketchUp and then eventually VR? Turns out they can. Turns out the measurements that are on architectural plans, you can take those measurements and literally cut up those images, put them into SketchUp, and produce the life-sizing building from those architectural plans. Like, those measurements do generally hold true. And so I wanted to bring these plans that were digitized into SketchUp. Now, when you open SketchUp, let's see, there's a couple of videos here. But I presume you guys all know about CAD software, so I don't need to go into technicalities of how this actually works, right? Maybe, maybe not. The first point that I came across, so here is the model. And it's kind of incomplete, it's not disappointing. Because it turns out that actually in three-dimensional space there's no such thing as wall lengths. You actually have to create a block that is a wall. There is no materiality. So you know, a brick has weight and heft, you know, or a wall. Like these walls actually don't have, they're pixel wide. Now I don't know of anything in real life that is a pixel wide. And so you get all these kinds of incomplete gaps, etc. The architect didn't bother doing the back wall because there's nothing there. Just assume that you would just fill it in with your imagination, this kind of filler information. The roof just says flat roof. Obviously the roof does not look like that. You can even see the walls here, etc. So this is what it kind of looks like as a 3D model, etc. perspective or way. And so you can bring this kind of object pretty easily into this plane. There is this sense of universality, this continuity of numeric thinking. I'll get to feminism in a minute. What becomes important is when you start thinking about this wheel use, you've got this object, it is general, it is ideal in that really kind of enlightenment kind of way. And so when you bring it into something like VR, you're immediately having to grapple with this idea of perspective. Well, what standpoint do we look at this from? Where is the fixed point? Where is the 0 point? How do you anchor this in space? And you get multiple choices when you build VR. You get the perspective of the camera. We saw a little bit of that this morning in the Keynote, which is talking about setting up the camera as a person. You get the object itself, well, what kinds of coordinate systems, what are the 0 points in that object, and as you saw, I turned the whole building upside down, which is a fantastic thing to be able to do, except that you really can't do it, again, in real life. It is this conceptual thing that you eventually have to materialise. And you can even choose the sun. I think some of the kind of pre-enlightenment geographers would be really overjoyed to see that humanity does indeed control the sun, and the sun can be put wherever you want it to be put. So you kind of get these different choices about how you do it and where you put it, and similarly, this is kind of how it appears in Unity. I put the sun inside the building because there's no reason why I couldn't put it inside the building. And this is what it looks like in VR. Well, this is what it looks like in Unity. I've got it on my phone if you want to see it actually in VR, but I didn't bring the headset, so maybe there'll be one out there. So this is just it, and you can kind of see how it becomes an enclosure, and you place yourself, here's the camera, here you place yourself in the building, etc. And when you go in, you can see the sun. But again, there's still this sense that you are the centre of this kind of universe. And so this question of we and you is actually crucially important to how we think about VR, because we and you defines this kind of centre point for the VR and the AR experience. So we're about to go in, so you can see here. And I wanted specifically to be put on the second floor. And I've sort of told this story a bunch of times. I'm not very good at Unity, and I stole someone else's. I'm much better at hacking things than building things from the ground up. So I stole someone else's settings, and I realised it was hard to bring the whole building up. It was hard to sort of bring myself up to the second floor because then I had to do the measurements for getting that high. So I just brought the entire building down. So the building is actually halfway underground, and I'm standing technically on the ground plane. But none of these things actually matter in the figurative land that is this digital space. So this is where we get feminist. So when you open up SketchUp, you encounter with Stacey. This is Stacey. She's the first thing that you see. She is at the origin. This is the origin here, 0, 0, 0. Stacey stands at the origin in her red converses. Stacey says here, Stacey didn't make a mistake. Stacey even has, she's not only a component, she has an identity, she has a personality. Stacey is a quality engineer on the SketchUp core team in a native Colorado. When she's not looking for bugs in SketchUp, she enjoys hiking and spending time with her family. Stacey is our body fixed point. When we think about the beginning of creating space, architecturally, Stacey is the default. I don't like Stacey. I don't know if you can tell. And I got to thinking, well, if I don't like Stacey, Stacey annoys me. If I spend most of the time I open up SketchUp deleting Stacey, who else could Stacey be? And I'm going to turn back to the 90s. It's felt like this back to the 90s kind of theory, sort of it's trending through the conference so far. This is great. To Donna Haraway, 1997, Modest Witness, thinking about Onko Mouse and female man. Now, if we can reimagine Stacey to be not just a body or the body, but could be anybody, and so we could choose it to be somebody in particular. If we're not trying to make it everybody, if we're not trying to go towards these universal ambitions that critical cartography has critiqued, if we're instead trying to situate it, well, why don't we make Stacey somebody else, anybody? And so, Onko Mouse and female man, as Haraway describes, are offspring of new genetic reproductive technologies. They are products of writing technologies. These are all these things that Stacey could be. Queer, as you were talking earlier about, Victoria. Gestated in but grown beyond the Enlightenment. I particularly like this when we think about the Cartesian, like its roots in digital technologies. Contingent, located, and situated. Okay. So thinking a little bit about Stacey. And I thought, well, maybe Stacey could actually be a what female are queer, these unsaved entities, then why is Stacey not also these bodies? Why is Stacey, she's constructed, but in her constructedness, she's also unfinished, she is this kind of modest witness that stares back at the technology, and we can actually use that to try and make some political points about the way in which these technologies are constructed. So I did what any sane person does when they've spent far too much time on SketchUp. I remade Stacey. Stacey, version 2. And so I did not like the context. Irony seeing as I'm wearing Stan Smiths, but anyway. So I remade Stacey. Stacey is a modest witness. Digital material cyborg, they stare back at the God tree and disrupt fixed points and absolute objectivities simply by existing. They cut off their hand in order to delete their wedding ring as an archaic relic of a previously patriarchal society. And so Stacey is kind of just, playfully, I just made a new Stacey. And now Stacey, this is the Stacey that reads me every time I open up SketchUp. But I decided to take it one step further and upload Stacey to 3D Warehouse on Trimble. Stacey has been actually downloaded this as an update 318 times, with actually far more downloads than views, which I can only assume that Stacey, so people have these sort of generated download, they just download without looking for things, they might just trawl through the website and download that kind of stuff, which in a way means that actually 318 times Stacey is going away into the world doing certain kinds of work that are completely immeasurable, but she is in this warehouse, and if anyone does collaborating or does this kind of VR work, Trimble is a god in amongst the pantheon of corporate companies that run dimensional modelling, surveying, construction technologies. And so I kind of like that Stacey's hiding in Trimble, doing this kind of, accidental political work. And I thought, well, if we're going to sort of take this kind of Stacey, when I'm thinking about who the modest witness might be in the story of Coupland 1, so much of the research is focused on Turing, who is his own modest witness. But actually this question of typist, I can choose to put the viewpoint wherever I wish. And I was naturally going to put it where Alan Turing sat. And I had this question like, but why should Alan Turing be the centre of the story? Why not this typist? This typist who we don't know who they are. We don't necessarily know what kinds of roles they played. I've kind of constantly, played with this idea of Stacey as the archetypist in a way. This kind of question of the other, the gap, the one who was forgotten, the one who doesn't have a name, the one who's not important in the story. Why do we not position our perspective there? And I think Stacey, as archetypist and the typist generally is really important in this story, because what Turing pretty much was trying to do was dismantle the role of typists. The point of the project of computing, particularly when he was in Manchester, was to make typing obsolete, to make the need to type into machinery obsolete. And so this typist is marked on his plan as part of a project that ultimately serves to make this kind of labour obsolete. And I think we can also take that as a feminist kind of critical moment as well, because we know that these kinds of automations of labour were not centred around male or masculine sort of jobs, but actually women's work. Secretary, clerical workers. For anyone who's sort of seen Hidden Figures as well, the kind of role of the computer, like we have computers who compute now. And so we think about the gendered and the raced way in which labour has been automated, and the role of this building in producing those systems. You suddenly get a very different understanding of this space, and this kind of understanding might be afforded through VR as well, this critical understanding. And there's a bunch of typewritten notes from Turing, partly his typing, but also this one he did not type, this one was typed by someone else. And then, if we think about it, Plant argues that actually maybe there's something even intentional, or sort of foundational in the digital systems. Oh, wrapping up, sorry. 0 and 1, 0 is supposed to signify a whole or a space, 1 is a sign of positivity, it's the opposite in digital systems. So I'm not going to go on much longer, because I haven't realised I've gone on for so long. So, because Hannah's too polite and doesn't tell me to shut up. Okay, so I just want to sort of point out that then when we think about the digital, mixed realities, etc., rather than understanding it as this desire for absolute access, then why do we not understand it as always situated, always contingent, always partial? Rather than giving into these universal ambitions, rather than giving into these overarching capitalist discourses, this hype that the digital can conquer the world, why do we not take up the early work around xenofeminism, Afrofuturism, and cyberfeminism that emerged in the 90s, say that actually digital technologies are partial, and we need to embrace that. We need to actually take that on board and use those partialities, those incompletenesses, these gaps, as Sadie Plant says, to find an anti-capitalist, a queering, a radical feminist, a decolonising way of understanding these systems of knowledge. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so thank you for coming. So I'm Sally, that's James over there, and we're sort of co-creators of LITCRAFT. I guess the main thing to say is it's an educational resource. So I'm going to talk today is not really a high-level research paper. It is sort of explaining the nature of the educational resource and our targets and aims are linked to that. So it's basically a resource that is essentially literary but also very spatial and kind of about the place and space of literature. It's actually it's like a spin-off really from a major project, HRC funded project, which is called Contradictories, which is about mapping literary place and space in new ways through digital technology, not VR at the moment, but 2D and 3D.
Watch this space.
Yeah. So this is like the impact element of that, I guess. Okay, I'm just trying to move my... So yeah, very simply, it's an impact project. It's based with schools and libraries and also museums. It's about re-engaging children with literary classics, using the Minecraft environment, and it's linked to educational resources. So very simple structure at the heart of it, which is which has been, I think, part of what makes it successful. Is it's kind of a linked resource. So it starts out in the world, in the text. It starts with the text. It moves into the immersive environment and it comes out. Goes back to the text. And this kind of virtuous circle has actually, which we sort of stumbled across by chance, really, has made it very successful. So the world, the build in Minecraft is an accurate scale model of the map at the front of the text, which means you can use that map to negotiate the in-game world, and the resources are directly linked to what is happening in the text. And so what we were trying to do was to create a model in which reading and gaming are not played off against each other, but actually they're working together to reinforce meaning, and that it has done that very successfully. So the way it works, this is the Treasure Island from Robert Louis Stevenson. This is like the contents of Treasure Island, and the highlighted sections are where we have a task linked to what's happening in the text. Ideally, we designed it initially for school use, although it has now been used by libraries. So the idea originally was you'd be reading the whole book, and then at certain key points you'd use the resource linked to it. But we also now have like a minimum read as well. So when libraries started using it, they're often not reading the whole book, so we kind of redesigned it. So you must always have some text, we always want some reading experience, and thinking about the text before you go into it, we have like a minimum and a maximum read. So to give that sense of how they reinforce each other, the first task, in-game challenge if you like, is centred on My Shore Adventure. So in the book, the boy, Jim Hawkins, who's the narrator, runs ashore, he sneaks onto a boat, he gets onto the island, he's not really meant to be there, he runs around and sees various things happen to him. So, if you're teaching it, you'd read, hopefully, that whole chapter, at least the minimum read, and you kind of think about Jim's character, why did he do that, was that okay, have a look at the map, think about the island, and then you go into the in-game task, and actually that's a different in-game task, but the first task is a scavenger hunt. You read in the book and it will tell you what to do. So you open the chest, read the book, and it will tell you what to do. So in fact, the first task of Treasure Island is running around the island, finding lots of things. This is actually the third task, search for treasure. And so the child is reenacting essentially what happens in the book. The first person narrative perspective of Jim as narrator is then sort of reinforced, if you like, by the first person within the world. And then if I were teaching it, I'd come out and get them to write up a piece about how did it feel to explore an unknown world, or how do you think Jim felt. And so this is kind of the structure, basically. When we first did Treasure Island, we found that a lot of teachers and librarians immediately said to us, it looks really good, but it would work best with reluctant readers, so we hadn't really thought about that. So this concept of children who are struggling with reading for different reasons, and so we started to think about that. This is a standard model used to teach children to read in primary schools in the UK. And basically what it shows you is there's an axis where you could be good at everything, you could be bad at everything, but actually a lot of people are in this axis where you might have good comprehension but poor decoding, or good decoding and poor comprehension. And so I started to think, actually, LITCRAFT meets the needs of all these different readers. So, and there are different kinds of reluctant reader when you start to think about it. So you can have a very good reader who doesn't read because they play games all the time. And so ironically, it's actually using that. He's using the gaming environment to return them to reading. And you can have a very poor reader. It will definitely help them because it will give them context, it will increase their understanding. But we then redesigned it a bit to put more tasks in, that were sort of simple comprehension tasks, simple decoding tasks in the next build. So the next build was for Kensuke's Kingdom, which is a really great book by Imogen Lester-Moseley. We stuck with the idea of an island narrative, which is our kind of theme, for various reasons, mainly because it's a very self-contained world, they can't wander off, but also it works really well to have kind of linked island theme. And Kensuke's Kingdom, much simpler text, much shorter text, still very powerful, and so we had more tasks linked to it in game. And as I say, it's like kind of slightly simpler tasks. So for example, the first task is called Finding, so it's another locational task, and you have to move around the island, find 4 beacons that are located at these different spots. And when you find a beacon, so for example, Kensuke's boat, there's a very short passage from the book put on there. So Kensuke, my island, he brought his hand down sharply like a chopper. And the question in the book for the kids is, what is Kensuke trying to say? How is his hand like a chopper? So they can write a little answer and then they can say. So a very short, simple task. We also have kind of creative tasks. I always have a creative task at least. So again, in the text, Kensuke, the Japanese guy there's a Japanese guy who's abandoned on the island from the war, and then Michael, the English boy, who's abandoned there. It's about their relationship. And so at the beginning, he kind of makes a model of the island and draws this line and says, you're on this side, I'm on this side. And this is just showing you, so in the game, you can see this line in the sand is like marked on across the island as well. And so we have a kind of link task at that point in the book, where the children go to a kind of flat piece of sand off the coast, and they can build a model either of the island themselves in colour or in sand, or they can do something that represents the island, so something like a turtle, something for them that signifies it. And then you can take a screenshot from above and you can get those images out of the game as well. It's also very useful if you have reluctant writers, so reluctant readers are often also reluctant writers, and so you can get kids writing in game, and you can then take a photo of that and get it out of game and say, actually, you don't think you can write, but actually you've written quite a lot. So I think it has quite a lot of potential. It works great with mainstream kids, but I think it does have a lot of potential with low ability kids or autistic kids as well, and various kinds of challenges to reading. Now, right at the end of the book, he finds his parents come back to find him. So the last task, you go off into the deep ocean and you find them out there. So yeah, just a couple of bits of feedback from that. We've got great feedback from the school trials and the library trials. And one concern I had was, will they just kind of zip through the book because they want to get onto the game? That's what, if I had to predict it, they're not really going to care about the book, they just want to get on the game. That did not happen, counterintuitively. And the libraries also said this, they were surprised that did not happen. So they actually worked really well to reinforce each other. So comments like this from the kids, maybe wonder what's happening next, being in the world made you think about what was going to happen actually in the book. And again, the last comment, to carry on playing, I need to treat the next part, each help the other. So it actually worked to kind of hook them back into reading. Better than I thought it would. So I was pleased with that. And the other key point, people dissing empathy, but I actually think empathy is great for fiction. Fiction is the place where you should be developing your empathetic skills as a kid anyway. And one thing that came through very strongly for us is it massively enhanced empathetic engagement with the characters. So that was the strongest thing that came through, and we got this a lot. When I played the game, I understood more of the book, how hard it was for him to be away from his families. And empathy is very difficult to teach, actually, in schools. If you're a secondary school teacher, it's a difficult thing to teach. So that's very useful, I think, to teachers and interesting. So that's just to give you a kind of taster of the kind of main resource. And I'm just going to talk briefly about kind of adaptation of that. So this is a geographic conference. I thought we'd kind of think a bit more about place and space out in the world as well. So we have a couple of museum builds that we're just doing now, about to do, over the summer. And so one of these is a partnership with the Wordsworth Trust. We're from Lancaster University. This is very close to the Lake District, and I'm an expert in romantic literature, so that makes sense to me. So Wordsworth lives in the Lake District, and he has this concept, very interesting concept called the spots of time. Essentially, I'll read it out and then I'll explain it. So he says, there are in our existence spots of time which with distinct preeminence retain a fructifying virtue, whence, depressed by trivial occupations and the round of ordinary intercourse, our minds, especially the imaginative power, are nourished and visibly repaired. Such moments chiefly seem to have their date in our first childhood. So Wordsworth, way ahead of Freud, basically says your very earliest memories before you have a continuous memory are these like pockets, kind of like bubbles, most of the time, that are held within you, and these are deeply essential to who you are and to your identity. And he's making the point for himself, these spots of time determine who I become. Without these kind of core elements, very, very early experiences and memories of them, I wouldn't have become a poet. And so in the Prelude, his autobiographic epic, he then describes these various, the first two books are sort of about his childhood, and he describes these childhood experiences in the lakes. And so what we're doing is creating a resource linked to this. So we have a Minecraft map of the Lake District to quite a large scale, which is what we need. Again, I'm just going to talk you through one example. So there's different examples. He like steals birds' eggs. He's quite a naughty boy, actually, William Wordsworth. He steals eggs. He steals a boat and rows out on the lake, and he goes skating as well. And these are kind of very famous passages in the poem. So I'm just going to read this as well. A bit of poetry, won't hurt anybody. And in the frosty season when the sun was set and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed. I heeded not their signs. Happy time it was indeed for all of us. To me it was a time of rapture. Clear and loud the village clock told 6. I wheeled about, proud and exulting like an untired horse that cares not for his home. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice and games, confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud chiming and hunted hare. So through the darkness and the cold we flew. So this is one of the very sensory, very evocative spots of time for Wordsworth, remembering these early experiences. This is a nice little image of people skating on the lakes when they used to freeze over, which they don't anymore. So what we're going to do is build a kind of frozen version of Windermere using those maps, and then we'll have a little reading of the passage outside the game, read the passage, same thing, same model, comprehension, and then go in and kind of reenact this experience and kind of respond to the poetic text. And then this is going to be located within the museum space. So the Wordsworth Trust has got a massive rebuild of the museum for next year. Next year is the 250th anniversary of Wordsworth's birth. And so for Wordsworth 2020, they're going to relaunch the space, and this resource is going to be in a corridor in the middle of the museum. So what we're also going to do is then link it to objects in the museum. So you do your ice skating, and then you go out and you have to go around the museum and find both the passage, the manuscript that has that in, and one of Wordsworth's skates, which is in the museum. And so it's kind of, again, linking the outer world to the inner world, I think. And finally, 1 minute to go, second museum project. So that's kind of rural landscape project, and we also have an urban one with 7 Stories Newcastle, which is the National Children's Literature Archive. We're going to build this like a map of an area in Newcastle with tower blocks and a kind of disproportionate tower block with various creative literary activities inside it. Okay, so if you're interested, come to the workshop this afternoon. And then.
I like a presentation plug at the end. Well, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I do. I wondered how you actually got into this. As someone who's studied the romantic poets and now builds fantastic environments in Minecraft.
Yeah. Well, partly through James. So James and I had a pilot project which was called LITCRAFT, and the words one is kind of returning to that a bit. So we did, we got some HRC money, knowledge exchange money, and we did like a pilot project using a lakes map and had sort of environmental.
So it's derived from the corpus of Lake District writing, which is a corpus of early travel writing about the area, and I had the idea of trying to use Minecraft to adapt that material to a younger audience, to introduce corpus linguistics and corpus analysis to school-age audiences, and part of that included a Swallows and Amazons build, a very small part of it, but that took off really well, and that sort of indirectly led to.
So that was one major thing. So
and also you had a 7-year-old son at the time as well.
That was also another significant factor, I think, yeah. So,
So my name is Gareth W, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the Building City Dashboards project at Maynooth University in Ireland. My colleague here is Oliver Dawkins. He is our 3D data and immersive technologies expert, as well as our data and training coordinator. So we're going to talk today about a piece of work that we're doing on immersive geographies, and this is a smaller part of a larger project that is intended to focus on the application of mixed reality technologies for urban data visualizations and just basically exploring and extending the modality of city dashboards as they are presented traditionally. So, what is a city dashboard? Well, city dashboards are data portals, and as many of them exist today, they are used to present a curated list of data sets, and these are representative of the respective cities. So Dublin has one, New York, London, there are lots of city dashboards around the world, and these data are collected together by a diverse number of organizations, and each of these institutions have their own agendas to fulfill. And the data then are also used by secondary stakeholders to make more informed decisions about their daily lives, such as, is it raining? Should I take a bike from the bike hire station, or should I just take the bus? You know, these are the type of things that we're looking at. So the data that's generated in smart cities like this are also being used to contribute to discourse around how cities are quantified and how data can be accessed, collated together, and then compared to other cities around the world. So the immersive geographies side of what we do. Well, we're exploring how emergent mixed reality technologies can be used with this city data in a number of different ways. So, for example, to bring the world around us into the virtual, or to intermix our everyday lives with digital objects and information. So on top of this as well, we're also interested in how mixed realities can also be used for presenting and communicating data via multimodal interactions, where the urban data themselves can lend themselves to new approaches in experimental natural user interfaces and other communication techniques that can potentially afford our users a deeper understanding, and this is across the range now, not just students and academics, but people from the street as well and in communities. So, existing mixed reality technology can take lots of different forms, and I'm not sure about the room, so I'm going to go a little bit into that, just to explain and talk about something called Milgram's reality virtuality continuum, basically real and virtual on either end of that. But on this continuum, the technologies that we readily recognize as such as augmented reality, virtual reality can be put. And this also includes things called augmented virtualities as well. So simply put, this continuum is used to describe the degrees to which the physical and digital content that we have are used in a digitally mediated experience. And this enables us then to create composites or entirely new environments and experiences where physical and digital entities can coexist together in varying degrees and can be interacted with in real time. So, from exploring new mixed reality data visualizations from contemporary research practice, we can already see a shift towards how different multimodal displays, the techniques can be explored, basically, and where these multimodal displays can greatly benefit both the creators of data and the users by providing them with novel and quite qualitatively different experiences. And they can also then communicate this data across multiple media and in multiple sensory registers as well on top. And this potentially means that we can lower the cognitive load that is placed on our users by engaging with this multimodal communication. And it means that we're able to also bring in these things, the urban mapping applications that we're looking at, and create them and program them as a full-bodied experience, something that, as evidence has suggested, enhances the perception of usability and the overall user experience of these technologies. So urban data on our dashboards, they represent a phenomenon that occurs within a geographic space. And these data can be explored in multiple ways, and they're used to help us to understand what gives these places their specific characters and their meaning. And at the same time, what the data tells us and the perceptions of the individuals that are on the ground there can greatly differ. And this sort of the city and the data relating to it and its interpretation depends upon many different factors, such as the physical aspects, the scale, the perspective, and the intention of the user. So from a material perspective, we can focus on the physical attributes of the city, such as its infrastructure, the buildings there, and the environmental conditions. And from a social perspective, we could also focus on, say, the thoughts, feelings, and intentions of the people that live in these environments. So the spaces and events represented in data visualization often fail to resonate with people's experiences of sense of place. And this is a limitation. This is a limitation of the kind of representations of place we find on GIS maps and on city dashboards that we make. So we're reflecting upon that to try and improve upon it. And it's something that we feel could be potentially addressed through the use of mixed reality technologies. So bringing together real-time city data, 3D modeling, and the citizens, we can potentially then contribute to the creation of a replica of the urban landscape. And by doing so, we can establish a bridge between the physical world and the virtual worlds that we've been talking about today. And at the same time, there is a growing interest among urban municipalities in the creation of these real-time digital twins. And these are digital representations of a system of interest. that are coupled with their physical counterpart. So they're coupled with their physical counterpart in such a way that the relevant changes in the latter are tracked and updated in the digital version in real time. So that's empty. So this time, so this digital twin, thank you very much, is being enabled through the use of multiple sensors and communication and sharing through this thing that you might have heard a lot of recently, the IoT, the Internet of Things. So in a virtual environment, we can enable real-time experiences of data-driven experiences, data-driven environments. But at the same time, we also want to include the more qualitative experiences of place that are perhaps much harder to capture than the numerical output of a sensor network. And what we aspire towards in our current explorations of multimodal interaction is a means of engaging both together, both the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of urban data and the phenomena it represents. And this includes real-time data visualizations for hire bikes. So you can see here visualization that includes hire bike data feed. And this also expands into the more imaginative representations of areas of the city, rather than just a literal model that you often see with the data just overlaid on top of it. So while these new computational techniques can allow us an overview of the city in real time, mixed reality can provide us with much wider opportunities for the visceral or multisensory encounters that we can engage data with. And these are ones that could potentially provide new avenues for citizen engagement as well. So we plan on implementing this by making urban data more immediate and meaningful by placing it in a context in such a way as to better inform some of the policies that directly affect the places that people live and work in. And by enriching urban data visualizations in this way, we can then potentially provide a deeper qualitative meaning to the data, relating it to events that perhaps fall outside of the citizens' immediate spheres of experience. So we've explored this in our first workshop. So the concept has been gone through the cycle once here, where we held a workshop at the Science Gallery in Dublin on the 1st of June this year. And in the session, Oliver and the rest of the BCV research team demonstrated a virtual reality application, showing the different ways in which different media could be used to enhance a 3D model of the Dublin's Dockland area. And this is a 3D model that was commissioned by Dublin City Council and made openly available for anyone to use. So there's a large chunk of Dublin in 3D that you can access for free, and the County Council went out and procured that from a surveying company. So there's a very interesting free resource for you there. So the team then took the people from the workshop, from the classroom, from the meeting room, on an expedition on foot into the Docklands area. And the workshop visitors were then, they then captured sounds, they captured still images and 360 videos, and were shown how to use their mobile phones to capture and create their own 3D photogrammetry objects for inclusion within this model. And you can see one kind of there represented behind the title. And so the group basically learned how to generate their own content that could be included in an enhanced, co-created 3D model of this area. And this form of public engagement can potentially be more inclusive of the greater citizen populations that occupy these spaces and help them to create their own representations of digital space, digital place rather, where members of the public can be more directly involved in the capture of 3D city data and can contribute to the production of a 3D model of a city through the use of open source software and open data, and 3D editing packages, photogrammetry, and training and outreach processes like we went through. And the sort of wider implications of this research could potentially be seen in future outreach programs like this, where the same learning process can be integrated into civic engagement projects, and where citizens can learn how to capture, process, and present multimedia content in their own 3D projects. And as a future technology for narrative and data dissemination, this can potentially expand both citizen engagement with data and encourage them then to also contribute more of themselves for the creation of digital representations of place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone's running on time. So does anyone have any questions for, yeah?
I work for the Environment Agency, and this is kind of, I think we should be pursuing a lot more. When playing about with this kind of thing, one of the problems that always comes back to me is, I guess, the difference between operational data that we might produce, like a flood model, for example, a flood risk model output, overlaying that in a georeference 3D space, often serves more to highlight the imprecise nature of the flood models or the data that we're trying to display than do a good job of visualising. And it feels like to me there's almost an interpretation layer that's missing out. Have you experimented with that, or is that something that you've considered or you're aware of?
We did go in and speak to the OPW, the Office of Public Works in Ireland, and they were very interested in both the modelling, but I think their plan was to use the virtual reality purely for a kind of, if we put a bridge in or something like that, we want to see that. We've looked at the modelling, and I think there is, we use game engines because they give you a lot of versatility in the kind of data that you can integrate, but I think there is a difficulty if you want to show real-time visualizations as something as complex. If you actually want to show the flows of the currents, there's a certain amount of abstraction that needs to happen in order to do that. I've been lucky in that I've been given a lot of opportunity with the project to try bad things and see if they actually work or not. So, for example, I think a couple of slide backs there was a kind of heat map, like a 3D heat map. Now, in VR it more really creates an atmosphere rather than, so pure virtual reality isn't always a good way to try and communicate these kind of messages. You can show sort of the rising of water very easily, but to give an overview of a complex kind of watershed model, it's probably not necessarily the best way to visualise that kind of complex information, and arguably seeing stuff on a 2D display for that, because you don't need the immersion for a lot of these kind of visualisations. I think what they do give you is a sense of place that's always lacking from the kind of, definitely from the high level dashboard view, and then also even from the kind of abstracted map level view. So there's always a balance about the message that we're trying to tell, how we're going to tell it, and what the user needs to see. And I think it sounds like you want a moving dynamic GIS more than so there's a difference between a kind of a digitally mediated environment and a virtual reality experience, and it's you're looking for a real-time digitally mediated environment, if you like, but with a high-level overview perhaps.
Yeah,
or a hybrid. Maybe you need that top scale and lower scale view.
We've done a lot of research on people and how they can see data, I guess members of the public, and that most people don't understand maps or diagrams or even graphs. So it's something that more contextualizes. Sorry, yeah. It's
I'll catch you later about that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I'm already running a bit behind. The boss has just stuck his head in what we do. So thank you guys. I'm sorry to interrupt the talk.
Okay. You may have seen over in the other room, there's a funny little object, and there were some projections in the back room. That's a piece of work which I'm going to talk about now. And I'm going to give you the background on it and just talk about how it relates to some of the interests of this group. It's part of a project that I was invited to take part in with 2 other participants. And it was part of a initiative called the Post-Photography Prototyping Prize, which was organised by Photo Museum Winterthur in Switzerland and the Photographers Gallery in London. And they've been running this thing for a few years now. There's been various different competition entries and winners through the years. We were put forward as a potential competing team. And really the idea is to sort of think about post-photography as an emerging category, the idea of photography after photography, or photography that's aware of photography. Part of what I've been aware of as I kind of see some of the other presentations is, I think what critical photographic perspective can bring is an idea of, is to break apart this idea of the image as a kind of neutral object which is subject to a viewer, and think more about how the image has agency in the room. So we began with this point from Willem Flusser, and we started thinking about what does a photographer do? What does a photographer perform? The producer of images is somebody who is actively engaged in a set of behaviours rather than somebody who's just mutely obeying the instructions of technology. A lot of this comes from my interest in Willem Flusser, who's a theorist who really looks at technology as a conditioner of behaviour, but specifically photographic technology, as game, which intersects with what we're talking about today, but also photographers almost as functionaries who play out the instructions that the equipment gives them. Here he talks about photographers stalking through the tundra, and this will become more relevant as you see the work as it goes on. So to talk a bit about the background of it. So the prize, we won the competition last year in May at the Photographer's Gallery, and we had 24 hours to make this prototype. And we kind of cheated a bit because we had done conversations on Skype beforehand, so we definitely had a plan what we're going into. I guess post-photography, again, well, I kind of explained what it is, but Daniel Rubinstein gives a really good definition of it. It's an idea of photography that takes into account all those things that are supposedly extraneous to the image, like labour relationships, means of production, process, and behaviour. So it's photography sitting within a much wider web of human activity. It's even got coffee table books now. So it's become a thing. And post-digitality as well. We talk a lot about the digital as if we're still in this moment of, the post-digital condition is a kind of state of ennui where it's become kind of normal now. It's no longer anything more exciting. It's just the background noise of everyday life. And occasionally there's some wow moments, but it's gradually setting into this thing where digital is almost like wallpaper. So where do we go now that we've already kind of immersed in this background? This is the team who produced the project that you see next door. Myself, Adam Brown, Tabea Azali, who's a games designer from Switzerland, and Alan Warburton, who is a CGI artist who's done tons and tons of amazing, fascinating work, critical work on CGI. He reproduced BBC's old White City headquarters as a 3D model. You can navigate inside. He works a lot with ideas of gender, the alienated worker, critics of capitalism, etc. Some of Tabea's work. She does socially engaged games. This is a piece called First Strike, which is a nuclear war simulation where you have to be, I don't know if you've seen this one, it's an indie game where you game the apocalypse, basically. You have to decide to take the first strike. Cloud Chasers follows the journey of a refugee family across a desert in a futuristic apocalyptic landscape. This is Alan's work. This is a piece called Spherical Harmonics, which is some kind of twisted, surreal version of real estate in CGI. So he takes this, he works quite a lot with assets, which is acquired by purchasing them from asset libraries, but then he puts them together into interior environments which are decorated and so that they reveal their own construction. So they're kind of like, you know, digitally watched real estate environments, but as you walk through them, they morph, they blow apart. You know, it's very good. And Homo economicus is a piece he's recently made about male workers in the City of London and the way their bodies and their bodily behaviour is commodified by the system. So the way in which the male body is behaved and conditioned. This work feeds into where this project is going. And this is some of my work in the background. I like, as I said, taking cameras apart and putting them back together again in order to subvert the system. This was a single pixel digital camera built with Arduino, and I ran 3 or 4 workshops with these where I tried to get people to construct a camera from the basic electronics, all of which ended in colossal failure, but the process was very, very interesting because we were thinking about what is technology, and with a bunch of guts all over the table, you're starting to work in a tactile and haptic way with the things that are otherwise a black box, which is another term which film philosophy uses very often. I also have a side interest in digital architecture, hence my comments to Vincent, where I write a lot about CGI architecture and real estate and the economic impacts of CGI architecture. And these are universities made from fragments of universities that don't exist yet with a generative system. This is the future campus developments that actually need to be built. You know, they just sell the idea of futurity to an eager audience willing to shell out and get costly in debt for the hope of possible future prosperity. So that's us. We divided into a team. Alan, he occupied the light and space part of the triangle. Tabea, game, narrative and story, and myself, player. Some of our inspirations: Gareth Martin. This was a self-published book actually last year, and it's a project called Continuous City. And he goes around, he's a gamer, but he loads up film into an analog camera and then photographs the streets of GTA and then produces them in a dark room. So it's street photography, okay? It's where I cut my teeth, go around, 35mm camera shooting black and white film in the 80s. Here he is going around the streets of digital landscapes as if he is, Robert Frank doing his thing. I love that project. Alan was quite interested in the way we used in the process and how things break down. So this idea of being generative, we talked about the generative. Generative photography is photography where you're photographing things that you've set up to happen. You put a mechanism in process, the mechanism produces stuff, and then you capture it in some form. So you might produce an algorithm in processing, some other coding language in Python, it generates visuals, and then you as the photographer or the image maker, you sit back and you capture chunks of that process that I guess you select either on a semiotic or an affective or aesthetic basis. As your handsome white falls into that kind of category. Some really interesting things. But light is really, really important to the project. If you have a look at the landscape we built next door, the way in which light and time produce themselves. It's made in Unity. A lot of models are done in Maya. There's a lot to get in here, so excuse me if you can ask me all about this afterwards. So generative photography, okay, produced by process. But effectively with generative processes, you're setting something in motion in order to produce indeterminate results that could potentially carry on in infinite temporality. For example, Jem Finer with a musical piece called Long Player, which is an algorithm written for a Mac, which plays Tibetan singing bowls in such a way that it could last infinitely without ever repeating itself. And this is on display in Trinity Boy Wharf in London. So wonderful. Let's skip ahead a couple of slides because I want to get to the piece itself. We're interested in, this thing about the moment of capture, the moment of the event, that you can predict an event happening. That you're never quite certain that it's going to happen. But causality can only ever be attributed after the event has happened. So you can only really say that this thing is causal post facto. Up to that point, it's only ever probability, it's only ever certain possibilities. Yeah? But time does not, that thing doesn't flow both ways. And I love the asymmetry of that. And so on and so on. Photography is becoming increasingly gamified. So there are plenty of online resources. And as a photography teacher, I've gradually been made redundant by various online resources which are promising people rewards for learning photography online. The moment of capture is problematic. The moment you decide that the image is sufficient to make a difference. Yeah? We started, I think, the least interesting thing about photography, if we talk about generative photography, is the moment of capture. Yeah? So having set some complicated thing in process, which is going to make something that doesn't look very much like a photograph, you then, if you just decide to press the button and do a screenshot at that point, you're doing something which is very much like a traditional photographer does, but you're not really thinking about how that landscape is produced. So we decided to remove the element of capture from our project completely and just generate a process that gets people to behave like photographers. So we built this landscape, and it's generative. It's built in Unity. It randomly populates a rotating sphere with trees, fronds, objects, rocks, which are all assets which are acquired from resources you find online. And it spins around, and the time of day changes, and the lighting changes entirely random, entirely generatively. Now, we could have just left it at that, thought, right, we're going to do what Gareth Martin's done, and photograph this generative landscape. But we thought, what if we tried to make it so that you have to actually creep up on it and stalk it? So as a photographer, if you're hunting an animal through a forest or through a landscape, you're trying to get the perfect shot. But it's more interesting what the landscape has got you to do, the way it made you behave. And if you think back to Alan's piece about city workers, he's talking about how the city makes people use their bodies in a certain way. It's how technologies and modern technology, the way technology is integrated in culture, causes us to react and behave in a certain way. So we're trying to get the interactors with this game, or the players, to behave like photographers, but we don't care whether they ever get a picture or not, because that's not important. The machine next door that you see has got sensors that can detect whether you're looking at it. It's got facial recognition, and it's got a proximity sensor, which is an ultrasonic rangefinder, which spins around, and it can tell how close you are to it. And as you approach it, it knows you're creeping up on it, and at that point, it won't reveal itself to you. It will hide from you. It won't display the contents of this landscape that it's showing you. So, as with technology, it's hideously dodgy. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to cut to a video of this thing in action, because then you can see what it does. And this is a promo video that I made.
It's crazy how much the frame rate is
was 2 minutes, which is what we also say on those first 3 chairs. I'm going to cut to the end. So if you are perfectly still, the landscape stops spinning.
Okay.
And then a cat emerges from the undergrowth, and then the camera zooms in, and you actually see this animal there. But the ideal, we were kind of discussing this in preparation, and we thought, well, what if we created it to such a level of sophistication that you could never actually creep up on it without it detecting it? So the idea came about of having this game, which is almost impossible to approach. The aim is that you've got to try and creep up on this thing, and it will sort of respond to you if you're not there. So your absence will make something happen. And we really like that idea, because I think the way digital technology pushes everybody to be frantically active all the time, and the sheer destructivity of that. If you create something that that required you to be absent, or to do less, or to just relax, or just to not be present in that space, would be quite perverse, but I think really truthful. And I think one of the things we really want to do with this is to throw the experience back into the room. So the action's not on the screen. The screen is an object. It's something that creates function. But you have to really sort of be in the meat space to get the point of what this thing is. So it throws that responsibility for action back to you in that embodied space that you're in. It's a kind of it's a provocative piece of work, which is against this immersion that Sarah Jones talked about at the beginning. It's a kind of absolute riposte to all that stuff, where we are trying to create something that subverts itself at this point, because there's a need for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's going to have to be the quickest of questions.
One word questions, one word answers.
Yeah. So, Fraser.
Well, it's not really maybe a question so much as a comment. I quite like that thing you're talking about at the end there, especially because like most of our engagements with digital technology are about wanting us, always asking us to do more, so that we provide more data and it can collect more about us. So I like this idea that it's the absence that makes something happen. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
There you go, that was quick.
Yeah, good. Another quick one? I'll have the thing set up, so I'll get it up and running, so if anybody wants to have a look at it and play there over the day, that's fine.
Well, thank you all very much, Princess.
Thank you very much, Phil. There's a lot of pressure, isn't it? And also a bit of an unusual choice, really, because as Phil knows, I'm not the biggest fan in the world of VR, so you've really put me on the spot here to try and kind of give a keynote about VR. So I'm really hoping that there's something that everyone will get from this talk. And it's actually, one of the nice things, it made me fall back in love a little bit with VR from kind of looking at what is out there and what's happening. So I'm going to show you a bunch of work. Some of it's mine, some of it's other people's, things that I think is really interesting in the world of, should we say, immersion, and obviously VR fits within that. So I'm John, I should do that bit right. I'm a real world game designer. Yes, that is my actual job that people pay me to do. And so I used to be a AAA game developer. I used to work in Xbox and PlayStation games a long, long time ago. I taught people how to make games. And since about 2010, I've made games that take place in public spaces, so giant games of all different sizes and types, nearly always in technology. So, start my time again. Half an hour, right? Half an hour in a very warm room before lunch. So trying to talk about the things that I do. Over the last 20 years, I've had sort of three areas of my career. One was working in what I would call the games industry proper, so AAA games for kind of large-scale publishers. I had my own company that made iPhone games and digital download games. I ran a degree course at the University of Birmingham. That was kind of one games industry proper. Then I went into the world of making giant games for public spaces, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. And that was very much a startup that I travelled the world with. I'm not doing that anymore, so that will tell you, I guess, that it wasn't a massive success. There's a big story behind that. And then in the last 4 years, I've had a company called Museum Games, which is a much simpler way to explain the kind of things that I do. I make games and playful things for cultural spaces. And some of those are with some of the partners up here, including one that technically I'm not allowed to mention, but I left them anyway. I'm sure you can guess what it is. It's not being streamed, is it? So the things that I normally get paid for are stuff for museums and other cultural spaces, but there's this kind of crossover now where I build things in the kind of artistic space. So that's kind of escape games, immersive theatre, those kind of things. So I'm going to show you some of the stuff that I do in that world. So I think probably Phil has mentioned some of the touch table stuff that we've done together, maybe. So we've built giant touch table things, which I'm really interested in because it's about large collaborative spaces. Renga is this giant game that I kind of mentioned in passing, which is a 500-player game for public spaces that's held in somewhere like a theatre or an outdoor space like a car park with a giant screen. So 500 players come, we give them laser pointers, they have to self-organise, it takes about 90 minutes. It's a crazy experience, and you can see we did it in some multiple places. And then I was trying to rack my brains for all of the kind of VR stuff, since this is a VR conference, so I'm going to show you all the VR things that I've done. And this is a project we're going to talk about more in a minute. I actually built the University of Birmingham with. I was a contractor here for 3 years. I do other crazy things. So this is in the corporate training and gaming world. So I work with companies that run giant gaming events for hundreds of people, normally with enormous budgets, where we take over hotels or castles, or we did one in a prison last weekend. And this is a game that sits within that kind of larger game. So it's often we do a game where it's kind of 2 or 3 games with actors and everything involved, immersive experiences, people stay overnight. But it's a corporate training experience, so they're doing puzzles that are kind of related to their work. So the serious games question from earlier on is kind of related to that. And this is a game that's I would call it the kind of next step of escape games. So this is combining the kind of things that people do in escape games, the kind of things that people do in board games. It's a hybrid board game, video game. And this is now being used by a company that I work for in the corporate training world. They've actually used this in job interviews. So they've actually got people to kind of play the game and then kind of use that as a way of assessing them. Because you learn an awful lot about people by how they work in teams. And games is a great way of doing that. And this is a game that I've got at the moment. It's on tour. This is a piece of immersive theatre. It's for 24 players, and I'm going to hopefully talk about this a bit more later on. But it's a game that is set in a car park where the players are spies. And during the game, you come in and you get a ticket as a group, and that means that you get access to a car. So you're in a car park on a live stakeout as a spy. So we'll come back to that one. But it is touring at the moment, so you can see it. So all of the stuff that I make kind of fits into this group of things. The stuff that I make sits in between somewhere theatre, games and tech. I'm a software engineer from a long way back. I made games, and that's how I learned really. And I matched that with theatre. So I've been in a kind of smaller minority of people that have worked in the games world and have then gone into theatrical spaces. We've seen a lot more people come from the theatre world and making their things more game-like. So I'm kind of a bit unusual in that respect. And so it combines all these things, right? Real spaces, physical interactions with other people, and control of stories or non-linear storytelling of some kind. These are some of the buildings that I've got my stuff in, from national trust properties to castles to science centres to libraries. So I get to work in cool places, which is kind of nice. If you take nothing else from my talk today, I'm hoping there's other things you do take, but when I build things for the museum sector, the cultural sector, where possible, I try and do a kind of free cut-down tutorial of it. So on my website, if you go to drmuseum.tech, there's I think about 9 of these. There's even one on VR, which is massively out of date now, so you might laugh at it if you see it. But these are ways that museums can build interactives without employing people like me. So I get emails from all over the world, which is really nice, where people have used this stuff to put things in their spaces and their galleries. This one is really popular. Interactive touchscreen is popular, and Babbling Beasts, which is audio tour guides, that's really popular. Digital tour guides. So yeah, so all that stuff's free. It's all Creative Commons. So use it as much as you like, remix it, make money off it, and tell me about it. That'd be fantastic. Okay, so my connections with VR. So I'm trying to go back in time. I don't know how far back everyone else's connection with VR are. So, I was, what am I now? I'm 41. So I was a young teenager in the early 90s, which was the kind of first wave of the kind of out-of-home experiences with VR. Perhaps some of the people in this room also experienced that and kind of perhaps have worked with it. So these are my kind of connections with it. There was a company called Virtuality that appeared in 1993, and they built a whole range of these. Is there anyone nodding in the room? Does anyone remember this stuff? Anyone play this stuff? Yeah, that's good. There's a couple of people. So this was the kind of first wave of this kind of thing going into theme parks. Back then, when we still had arcades were a big thing, people went out and they put their 20p in the machine and played games. This was the kind of VR of the arcade world. And these were actually hugely popular. The company behind it, sold, I think, 60 or 70,000 of these around the world in various incarnations. Some would sit down. So this is the one that I played out of their 10 different titles, Flying Aces. And I think I played it either at Thorpe Park or maybe at the Towers. You had 4 of these connected together. So I didn't work obviously on any of these. This was kind of some of my inspiration. Anyone recognise this TV show? I'm really on my own this one, I guess. Yeah, a couple of people, right? So this was a very short-lived single season show that appeared on BBC, created by the same people that Nightmare, which is more of a kind of touchstone experience, but a slightly older age group. So following on that pattern of having somebody in a virtual world like with Nightmare, and then having other people kind of control them. And I've got videos of this with me if people want to see the whole video. It's on YouTube. I mean, it shows you, I mean, how much people were into it, but also how bad it was, right? Because that was the thing with VR, it was terrible back then. I mean, the frame rate, I mean, you can see the rendering is obviously really low, and this isn't so far away from PlayStation 1 era, so we know how much better graphics got. But I mean, the frame rate of this is like 3 or 4 frames a second. And in order to make this thing move, this guy's like doing this on touchpad and things. So, I mean, it didn't work, and in fact, some of these things, as we know, kind of caused more damage than they did good. And then this is some of my favourite kind of game shop. This is Epcot, so I once got to go on a fantastic family holiday to Disney, and I didn't go in '94, but apparently this ride started in '94. So this was their mock-up. This was from their R&D lab, the Imagineering labs, and they invited people in to play on it. So I mean, it was really cutting edge VR when we put this kind of stuff together. They had banks and banks of silicon graphics machines, if that means anything. Kind of back when computers were like the size of fridges, rooms and rooms of them. And what they had is they didn't quite know where they were going with it, with Disney, but at Epcot they had a ride they built which was this kind of magic carpet, Aladdin ride, and they invited people to go on it. So I was fortunate enough that I got to ride that and experience it back then. So perhaps all these things kind of influenced me, I guess, a bit in the kind of things I went on to do. So things that I actually made in VR, and I mean they're not amazing, I'm afraid, but I wanted to share them with you anyway. I did my undergraduate and postgraduate at Manchester University in computer science, and I was doing some, as well as games, the other thing I love is football. So obviously, what do you do when you do your PhD? You try and combine all of the things you love at once. So I was doing football analysis using computers, and there's this simulation league called RoboCup, and so I was doing 2 things. I was doing work in this simulation world, and I was doing work analysing Premier League video streams. So the idea of kind of taking the video footage from the Premier League and doing analysis on it, which I mean it's all happened now, but I mean this was 1999, 2000, that sort of deal. And there's no, fortunately I think for you, there's no videos of this or no images of what it actually looked like. But at Manchester we had access to the same technology that I mentioned that Disney had, these kind of huge machines that sort of graphics had, and access to a cave, right? I mean back then these were all the rage, and they've sort of, as with all VR, these things have come and gone repeatedly. We had access to this, it was probably millions of pounds worth of kit. And so I took my 3D viewer, which again I couldn't find images for, but just to give you an idea of roughly what it would look like. We had players playing football, it was all rendered in a lovely, had a Wembley Stadium 3D model that it all played in, and you could go into the cave, you could wear 3D glasses, you could sit there, and you could watch football matches, which I'd scanned from live football matches and then was showing in a viewer. This is a long time ago. I mean, it didn't sound that exciting, but I mean, I quite enjoyed doing it. But eventually I dropped out of my PhD, so it wasn't a massive success. So then anyway, so I was doing that stuff in VR and connected with VR. Then I ran off and worked in the games industry for people like Codemasters. I launched a games degree at the University of Derby. This has been given a lecture in Second Life. So I guess that's sort of a connection to this stuff. We were the first university, because of my connections from working in the games industry, we were the first university to buy an island in Second Life back in 2004, and I made a load of iPhone games and things as well. Okay, so clearly there's a big gap where I went and did things in the games industry proper and taught at university. Meanwhile, obviously, we know all about the kind of reboot of VR thanks to this guy, Palmer Luckey, who in, I think, 2012, in the summer of 2012, he did his Kickstarter, and he started all of this, right, because he collected all of those bits of kit that we talked about, those kind of crazy VR headsets from Silicon Graphics, and all of that stuff from the 90s. He was collecting all of that, and even at the age of like 15 or 16, right, he was kind of playing with that, and eventually decided that he was going to be the person that kind of relaunched it through his Kickstarter. Hugely popular. I think at the time it was the most popular Kickstarter, and I'm sure we all know the story that Facebook bought them for $2 billion or maybe $3 billion. Okay, so then all of a sudden these headsets are back on the market, right? You're able to get these for much cheaper amounts, and as we've seen from some of the talks, people have been playing this stuff for quite a while now. This is five years ago since they were available. So I was doing some contract work, and this is where being Phil first met actually, was over at the Digital Humanities Hub, which I would point, but I can't tell which direction we are over that way. It doesn't exist anymore, right? But the room is still there. I'm sure some of you may have been into this room at some point. Perhaps not. Yeah, a couple of nods. So this was this amazing space that we had for doing kind of digital humanities research, and we had these kind of crazy giant touch tables. We had this ridiculously huge 4K screen, which cost about 250 grand. Touch screens all around the room, and we had another thing that really was going underused. So you can't see it very clearly, but on the top, on the ceiling, on these mounts are tracking cameras. So some people might have come across Vicon tracking cameras. So they're the ones that are usually used in TV and film to kind of motion capture. So normally you'd have loads of those around the space to kind of capture every body movement. We'd be using them to catch people's general position. So you can see here's my old colleague Chris wearing glasses with the tracking balls on. That's me. I mean, we're doing some kind of fake staged photo shoot, right? So I don't know what I'm doing. But it looks like I'm using a tablet of some kind. But I've got the same markers on. So this system was getting massively underused. You know, this is a few hundred grand's worth of cameras on the ceiling. We had access to the DK1, I think at that time, the Oculus Rift thing. And as you can see, this is a fairly large space, like 10 by 20 meters or something. It's a tracked area. So even when people started to do the kind of small scale vibe tracking, it was kind of a few meters square. This was a massive space. So I was like, okay, I'm in academia, I can do crazy stuff, so let's do some crazy stuff. So put those two things together, right? The Oculus Rift, which doesn't have external tracking at that point, and these Vicon tracking cameras, which we've got 30. And my job then was to kind of help businesses around Birmingham who were kind of interested in this kind of using this kind of technologies. And so I worked on a business assist with a company locally, and we were trying to do this. There's a TV program about this now that some of you might have seen called Your Home Made Perfect, right? And the whole point is they do a kind of renovation of your house, but before they do that, they do it all in VR. You put the headset on, and you get to experience it. So we were kind of doing a kind of mock-up of that kind of thing, but 5 or 6 years ago. So the idea that we could plan out your kitchen all the way around here. We could stick a few people, put some headsets on, and you could physically walk around your kitchen. Right? You couldn't bump into anything, but you could see the whole space. That was the kind of idea behind the assist, and we did a few mock-ups of that. But obviously, I'm a games person. I'm not going to stop there, am I? So I mean, again, I don't have any good pictures of this, but this is the kind of setup, and you would have seen this a number of times since, because it's quite a good idea, right? Loads of people have done it since, and loads of people doing it at the time. So you've got your Oculus Rift headset on, you've got a hat with the markers on, and you've got a backpack with the tech on it. And that's talking to a load of kind of Vicon tracking software. And this was the mock-up we were originally given for the room in Unity, I think that was, a long time ago. So that was our very first ones, were to let you walk around the room, and the doors were all at the same point. So in the virtual space, when you touch a door handle, it's there in the real space as well. And it's really powerful when that happens. So then, obviously, the next thing I'm going to do is marry that with game technology. So this is a Nintendo Wii controller, and obviously you can see it's a gun. And normally you put the Wiimote controller inside it. But what I've done is I've taken one of those sets of glasses and kind of mounted them on top in a certain pattern. And then this also talks over Bluetooth. So when you pull the trigger and you reload it, all that works. There's me, lovely modelling the setup. So without the VR headset on, but the idea of the cap and the gun with the markers on, and what you'll see on the wall behind are the green bits of the cameras and the yellow bits of the two things that the machine can see. And then I married that with the gaming of the day, which was a kind of a zombie shooter called Left 4 Dead. So this was the idea you could play a real Left 4 Dead, and zombies would come running out of the doors, and you could shoot them, right? And it was a good idea, but it never kind of went anywhere because it was in academia and it wasn't really part of my job. So obviously we've seen this go on. I'm sure many people have come across these things. So since then there's been some other academic work, but also the Void have been hugely successful at doing this. You can watch these videos of them. This is them doing it in 2016, and you can see it's the same setup, right? It's the same headsets, it's the same tracking markers that you use. And so they've converted this into a commercial operation. And it's hugely successful. Disney have got a whole bunch of these rides now, based off the back of that, around Star Wars franchises and real life Ghostbusters. IMAX did a similar thing, and again you can see the same setup, right? They started theirs in 2016 as well, but I've since shut down. They shut down at the end of last year. a bit of a shame, but maybe not the big success story it was going to be, but obviously I had the money to kind of do that thing. So then, I've not made a load of VR stuff since then, so I'm going to talk about some other things that are kind of related. But I think it shows these ideas just kind of, they come around again and again, right? And as the technology gets cheaper, we can kind of revisit them. So I get some of my money from working for corporate clients in the cultural sectors, building things for them, games and whatever. And some of the money that I get to do crazy stuff comes from the arts world. And it's almost like a bit of a running joke at the moment in the arts world, and it has been for maybe a couple of years. It's almost impossible to get money if you don't include VR, AR, or some kind of cross-mixed media version of it. So it's been kind of frustrating for a few years, not wanting to make VR stuff and kind of realising that all the money is there to make it. So maybe I should have done this talk a while ago, and then I'd have been more excited about it. Yeah, more thought. So I think I'm going to just gloss over this point for now, but I mean, AR is going to be a success, already is a success. And you know, the hundreds of billions of dollars that is worth in the next couple of years, all of that seems to be coming true. I'm sure people in this room have tried HoloLens and Magic Leap.
Magic Leap, yeah.
Sorry?
That's it, Magic Leap, yeah.
Magic Leap. I'm getting confused. Leap Motion, sorry. That's why I'm confused. Magic Leap. Yeah, so I'm right. Good. So then I made stuff in AR. This is a thing that I made quite recently. In a sequence of Queenswood, which is over in Hereford, and again using your phone as the kind of device for AR. So going to particular locations and having content appear in those locations is it's a kind of a running theme in a lot of things. It's the Pokemon Go style experience. So this is you follow instructions. This is the kind of mock-up version. So still debug messages on the screen. But the idea that you go to a certain place in the woods, and when you get there, you get to meet characters, you get videos, and you get audio of who you meet, and the story kind of unfolds that way. That's a nice thing to do. It's quite easy to do, relatively speaking. And obviously, it uses people's phones. For me, it's a shared experience, which is also an important thing for the things that I make. Bringing people together to have that experience, I think, is very interesting compared with VR headsets, which is quite exclusive in some respects. And I've also built stuff, and I've always included this in the category of AR. So, I mean, augmented reality to most people, I think when they initially see it, it's about holding up your phone and like a dinosaur pops out of your desk or whatever. Those are the kind of things that we saw, a lot of that kind of gimmick stuff. But for me, audio, I think, is really important. I use this a lot. A lot of when you're walking around in the real world and you get augmented audio. And I think that the things that I make, that's really powerful because it means you're still connected with the real world, but you've got this kind of overlay there. And it's not through a screen. So you can keep your phone in your pocket if you want to, or you can have a shared device that you listen to, or you can use bone conductive technology so that your ears are still free. So there's two versions of this. One was done for historic royal palaces, that's what's important in the background. This was a mock-up for them, a prototype game called Farmer George's Flock. And it was a family game that lasted about 45 minutes, and each team were given a sheep. What sheep was it? It wasn't called Sean, I remember that much. Anyway, you carried your sheep around with you. Your sheep is your game controller. So where you carry it in the world, the sheep knows where it is, and that's what makes decisions in the game. So if you carried your sheep to a character, to another statue, in this case it would know you were walking towards that statue, it would comment on the fact you were doing that, and then when you got there, you get some kind of, that would be your decision point in the storyline. So it was a kind of Disney-esque story of you saving the flock, and it was all based in real history. So merino sheep were raised in Hampton Court Palace, so it was all tied in with that kind of real stories. And if you want to build this stuff, this is the kind of free DIY version that I do quite a lot with kids. So there's a load of stuff you can just kind of download. You can do this on any Android phone with NFC, this is called near field communication technology, and you can run your own version of it. That's the kind of budget version. This one, was a custom app that was built. We had actors come in and voice the characters and others. So the question is this kind of stuff, right? These are the pictures we see again and again of VR and how amazing it's going to be. And I mean, this is sort of like everything that's wrong, I guess, with VR. You know, obviously people are having a great time, you know, they've all got their coffees, they've got their check shirts. This woman's got a didgeridoo, I don't know. But clearly it's all great, right? But for me the problem is, this is the kind of mixed reality, like dual reality. There's one person who's in the experience, right, who's trying to be involved in it. She doesn't appear to have headphones on, so she's not completely immersed in it. And then everyone else, they're not quiet, are they? They're kind of talking to it. So there's this problem of how can you possibly be immersed in a thing when you're in the two realities simultaneously. And I think that is a problem for the kind of experience that we make, and some of the things I'll show you kind of address this more. But that's always been a problem for me. Like, it's so final, right? When you put your headset on, you're making such a decision. But it's not just a decision to do this, it's a decision to not do all of the other things. You know, if I sit and watch a film at home, I've still got my phone open so I can look at it, I can still, you know, pop out of the room or do other things. You know, there's a reason that people go to places like the cinema, because it kind of closes all of that stuff off. I should do. But a headset is quite final, and it's quite singular. And there are more stuff that's addressing this. I think that's one of the problems. I mean, this is stuff that we're, you know, right? We don't have the killer app yet, which is the kind of classic thing. We've got lots of things that are good, that are out there, but none of these are the kind of the must-have thing that are going to make people rush out and buy it. And we are seeing better sales figures, right? So there is a slight increase in this world. And so the most popular VR device is the PSVR, which sells about 2 million a year, we think. I mean, that's to a kind of gamer audience, because you need a PlayStation to kind of run that. 2 million sounds like a large number. Does anyone want to guess how many iPhones are sold every year? It's more than 2 million. So yeah, for the last 5 years they've sold over 220 million per year, right? And they're not even the biggest. Sorry, did you get that right?
Yes.
Well done. Well done. And they're not even the biggest. They're not even the biggest manufacturer of phones anymore. It's Samsung. But you know, this is a very premium experience that people are willing to pay many hundreds of pounds for. So I kind of feel like it's in the category. But you get the right idea, right? We're selling some of these, but not many, and it hasn't had the massive success that kind of relates to the Facebook $2-3 billion purchase. And then all of this stuff you've seen before, right? You know, this is the sales pitch of what VR is. You know, it is the holodeck in your home. But of course it isn't, right? You can't do the stuff you can do in the holodeck in VR in your home. Although when I decided on that as the kind of title for my for this slide, and I put that into Google, this is the picture that comes up. And apparently this company claims they can do that, surprisingly. So whoever they are, I've cropped off the name now, but I can look them up for you later. So when I said, obviously, you can't have the holodeck, they were like, you definitely can. So I'm wrong on that. So when I started doing the kind of out-of-home experiences, which we call them, in 2010, this was really what I was kind of latching onto, this kind of desire for people to get out of the home, to have more kind of shared experiences when they weren't passive, when they were doing something. And in my world, we're seeing an enormous growth in kind of immersive theatre, but again, that's quite a niche thing, the kind of punch drunk and secret cinema. Those things sell out massively in London, but that's not kind of mainstream across the whole country. We're seeing reasonably good growth in things like escape games. You know, there's 1,500 escape rooms in the country, and that's kind of like it's a term that most people are kind of familiar with, at least. And so the things, so we already know that VR's got some problems, but the things that I care about in my experiences are things like being able to do proper collaboration with people, so having eye contact, being able to reach the body language. And these things are still very hard to do in VR. So I'm just going to show you one project in a bit more detail. And you can come and see this, which is kind of nice. It's been to Birmingham already, it's been to London already, and we're going to go on tour to a few other places. It goes to Stockton-on-Tees, next to the Riverside Festival, if anyone knows the International Riverside Festival. And tickets are free, amazingly, so you should definitely come and see this if you go further north. And these are the people like Tim, although we all kind of cross over in what we do. So the experience is virtual in some respects. It's not a VR headset, but it has virtual elements to it. So it's a 90-minute experience. There's 24 players. They're separated up into teams in 6 cars. There are 4 live actors that populate the space, and there are, depending on who you interact with, there are up to 15 virtual characters who you can interact with. Blah, blah, blah. So this is the story. Essentially, we've got this guy. He's our politician. We started this project about 4 or 5 years ago and wrote the story long before the crazy politics of recent times, and it's amazing how much we've kind of fallen. It's a bit worrying. So he's our politician. He's on this kind of meteoric rise. He's trying to do this good thing. He's trying to create this climate change bill. And he's got the kind of buy-in cross-party. So things are kind of going well. But obviously, as with most politicians who are successful in some way or another, they've got some dodgy past and some things in there behind the scenes they might not want to come out. So our role is we work for MI5. We're investigating into him and what he's doing. So he is here. Let's say we're doing the show today. He's here. We know that he's going to do his press conference in 90 minutes. He's going to announce some new deal with Toy How, which is a car company. So what we've got is we're going to investigate over that 90 minutes. We know that he's got a meeting planned in the car park. We've got some kind of information. So we're all going to go and stake out that car park. That's our plan. This is what it looks like. These are some really old pictures, I'm afraid, but I've got some new ones in a second. So the game is split up into the classic 3-act structure. And I'm sorry you're only getting the kind of 2-minute pitch version of this. So you get a briefing about what you're doing. You're our MI5 spies. You're going to investigate Michael. He's meeting in the car park. These are our suspicions of what he's up to. You then spend the next 45 minutes in the car park watching for him, and you use a mobile phone. You actually use a newer mobile phone. In the old versions, you used a Nokia, which we loved. But it doesn't work because no one knows how to use a Nokia phone anymore. I was surprised about. So then you do this kind of stakeout. You watch what he's up to. That's an opportunity to do kind of escape game style things, but story driven. So you're interacting with other characters to find out about his life. You come back and you share all the information you've gathered, and you make a decision. You make a decision as to whether or not we should destroy Michael's career, or we should let him carry on based on the information we found. And actually, that's bookended slightly by. So before you go into the game, you get to meet Michael. Michael is a politician. He's walking around. He's shaking hands. He's looking you in the eye. He's doing a selfie with you. So you've had that kind of personal connection with him, which is really interesting when you then start investigating into his life. And then after you've made your decision, you get to see the outcome. You get to see the speech he makes. So these are the kind of more modern photos. This is the briefing room. This is Lily. She's your handler. She's going to look after you. I think you might recognise one of the people there. That's Sarah doing it. So this is you then on the way to the car park. This is us in the car, watching for what's happening, looking through the documents from MI5, contacting other characters. So a lot of your gameplay happens through the mobile phone. You can phone characters, you can text them, you can hack into people's voicemails. So you get a lot of the story through that, all through virtual characters. This is interactions with people in it. And so I try to keep it spoiler free in case anyone does want to come and see it. But this is characters watching. That's Michael and who he's meeting. Kind of blurred out so you can't tell. And then you actually intercept a drop. There's a dead drop that happens. If you do well, if your team does well, you come back with some information. So then what is interesting in this for me is there's actually 6 separate stories. So there are 6 teams in 6 different cars, and the game is designed so that you see 6 different things. So as the actors come around, different scenes happen in different cars. And you investigate 6 different lines of inquiry. So you end up with 6 different bits of information. So when you come back into the briefing room and go, yeah, we saw Michael and we saw what he was up to, and then someone else will go, no, that's not what we saw something completely different. And so the idea is when you come back into the room, everyone's made these assumptions about what he's been up to and what he's been doing. And actually when you kind of collect that information together, only then can you then kind of make a decision. And that's the kind of wrap up bit of it. Some technology behind it that kind of makes it all happen, as with all of these things. Twilio is actually the same system you get when you phone up to your bank and you kind of get that kind of type in your account number or tell us your postcode. So we've kind of reused that system. And then this is some of the technology behind the scenes that makes that possible in the kind of conversations. So I think I'm going to, let me say this point and then I'll stop. So in terms of VR experience that are kind of interesting, and actually A Moment of Madness made its premiere at Flatback Film Festival, and this is something that I saw at Flatback Film Festival in 2014, and probably I was influenced by it and didn't realise it was it. So this is a VR story, and there were lots of problems with the production of this, but the idea is brilliant, which is you're at a dinner party for a family essentially, and everyone has got a headset on, so they're all watching this story. So you're not playing a role, but you're embodying a role. So I might be sitting in the place of the dad or the mum, and I get to watch what happens in the interaction. And it didn't quite work because of the video, but what worked really well is when you take the headset off and you go, okay, yeah, I know what happened. I was the mum, and this is what happened to me. And these, why were you so mean to me? And that's, you were the dad, right? You were really mean to me. What was that all about? And actually, what you start to realise is that everybody saw a different story. And so I was the mum. It turns out I was an alcoholic. I didn't see that. I was drinking. I had a glass of wine. I had a couple of sips from it. Everyone else saw me kind of lugging it back like crazy. And so it's really interesting to then realise and have a conversation that actually everything saw something different. So I'm going to skip the wrap-up because I'm out of time, right? Okay, so if anyone wants to see the wrap-up, you can come and speak to me afterwards. But there's some exciting things that are happening that aren't mine. Let me jump forward to one slide, and then I'll let you go to lunch. So you can contact me on Twitter or on my website. All those free tutorials are here. If you want a copy of those slides, they're all available there, including the exclusive never seen before wrap-up, which covers those bits that I can talk about. So if you just go to bit.ly, Cabaret's Geographies of Gaming and VR, it's John. Go to that and you can have the slides as well. Okay, John, thank you very much indeed. No problem.
This 2-minute quick fire, no questions, although any discussion obviously can be held throughout the rest of the afternoon. We've got tea a little bit later on as well after the first of the workshop sessions. So I would like to welcome first of all Nick Roshkuta, and his talk is on. Well, we'll find out when he flicks the switch.
Okay, digital landscape. So I wanted to use this basically as an opportunity to just dump a bunch of ideas on the floor. I'm going to write this up into a fellowship or grant proposal sometime over the summer. So I'm interested in any feedback anyone's got, any thoughts, especially if they think anyone's already done this, right? I want to read it. I wanted to start with a story. I'm an ethnographer. I like telling stories. I don't think I have time. But so the context of this is some ethnographic work in Chernobyl. I've recently been writing and thinking about phenomenologies and post-phenomenologies of radiation. I will come back to how that is relevant to games in a second. But I'm a landscape geographer, I have a background in landscape, and it's very straightforwardly like an obvious kind of subset of games, walking simulators, which are kind of very, very clearly in the traditional landscape tropes of like ruination, wilderness, rurality, these kinds of things. So the project's around this, right? Like the themes of rurality, wilderness, ruination, landscape games. But my approach is this: really obviously, we can think of games not simply as representations of landscapes, but as landscapes themselves, and therefore as field sites. This isn't anything particularly new. This is basically suggesting that you can do ethnography and digital ethnography. I have a background in walking methods, so I want to do walking methods in digital game landscapes. That's my approach. But what I really want to do is think through the post-phenomenology of digital landscapes. I'm particularly drawing from radiation. I go to feminist philosophical work from Lisa Rigore and Catherine Vassalou on a post-phenomenology and phenomenology of light, right? So that's where that's my relationship to radiation. And I really want to think through the materiality. So we talked earlier about the presencing of games, the embodiment of games. Those materialities which hold together digital worlds, digital subjects through which subjects come to be. So I basically want to do a project where I'm going to take those kind of feminist philosophies of light and think through that particular sort of photonic materiality of digital landscapes. That's kind of where I'm aiming at the time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. And next, it's Tash. Come on, Tash.
Can't actually remember how many slides.
I will brutally cut you off if you talk too long.
So basically my research is about a virtual reality church, which is basically it's a really cool kind of thing that logged onto a headset. Some of my MRes project ideas. So it feels like, hey, we've got this Oculus Go, give it a go. So I was like, yeah, sure. So kind of had a bit of a play. And one of the first things that popped up was Church World, and I was like, well, what's this? And these people actually do go to church every week in VR.
Church America. So from November up until, well, June, I just stopped doing my alternative for my project. I actually went to this church, so that avatar is actually me, the cat jumper. So yeah, like, the VR Church Europe starts at about 7 o'clock UK time on Sunday, and then the VR Church America was actually 12:30 on the Monday morning, so that was one of the things I had to stay up really late. It's all good. So essentially, which I find, I think that's about a minute probably. So a lot of the people that actually go to this church are people who are homebound and can't get to church in the physical world. So being able to pop a headset on means that they can actually have a church community and show their kind of, do all their worship and things they want to do, and it's really, really good. So yeah, there's a massive community here where they have a Discord channel, which is like a chat thing you can use offline, and they will kind of discuss prayer needs and just random, they have like gaming chats and meeting pages, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, these are the two main problems at the moment, which is there's people coming in causing a lot of abuse, which then have to be kicked, and then they have like a whole moderation team to sort that out, but that's kind of he's working on. And tech issues, sometimes the pastor can sound like a Dalek, or could like lag out, or you know, there's a worship video playing, you can't hear the sound. Insult. Cool.
And next up, Dani, who can't be with us, but he might be joining us by streaming, so just wave at Dani. On his work, where he's been using VR in relation to military drone strikes.
High-tech warfare is often associated with imagined, largely fictional sounds. Popular culture, news media and arms industry PR material propagate soundscapes that do not match with reality. The representation of US drones, of which you're now watching a fragment of an official promotion video, is a prime example of this. The animation features slick sounds of jet engines, robotic motors and lasers, but in reality, drones sound more like a propeller plane. Through a focus on slick soundscapes and clean animations, these representations of drone strikes support the visions of infallible technological efficiency and clean warfare that surround official narratives of military technology. I wanted to juxtapose this perspective with first-person accounts of civilians who have witnessed US drone strikes in their everyday lives. In July last year, I traveled to Karachi in Pakistan, where I interviewed people originating from the federally administered tribal areas in the north of the country. I spoke with them about their experiences of drone operations and asked them if they would be willing to sing their memories of the sounds. Sounds from the Air will be a virtual reality app that combines these focal impressions with digital video animations of drones and satellite imagery of the home regions of the interviewees. Thus, the work juxtaposes the slick visual idiom of official representations of high-tech war with personal accounts that oppose these sterile, spectacularized narratives. Today I'm presenting a draft version of the work, a video with mono sound and low-res animations. I'm still looking for people and places who would be interested to develop this project further with me. So if you're interested, please do let me know. Thank you.
Thanks, Dani.
Hi. So my project is a cultural geography study of the cultures of game development, particularly of the independent scene as opposed to AAA. And as like Nick just said, like the idea of games as landscape in geography is a big thing, and it's still a rising trend. I mean, we're all here to talk about games in VR. But like the way that we are kind of engaging with these games are like very similar to the like studies of film or literature or photography, and there haven't basically the spaces that people are creating games and what they want to reflect out of those experiences that they have. And what I've found really interesting is this kind of idea of the hegemony, I'm really bad at saying the word, of play, in that like the people who are controlling the industry decide what kind of games and what kind of like abilities are reproduced. And also the indie-apocalypse, which is the sudden influx of indie games that have suddenly become very commercially viable. But there's just so many of them that they need to pick and borrow from these kind of bigger games and kind of twist themselves into a more palatable format. So then when I was talking to people about what they found like while they were developing, they found that like there was this weird kind of tension between soft skills and technical skills. People saying like, oh, I was using Game Maker since when I was like, 10 or whatever, being very, very skilled, but it's the know-who that gets you into these places. I found that particularly when I attended events. And there's a weird like blurring when they start to make these games, and the places that they are creating the games and where they delineate like the workspace and their own space, and even in the office, there are these kind of like spaces for like recreation, and it's all just very kind of mixed. And I found that when I decided to make my own game, so I thought, why not kind of reproduce these ideas, and how do I react to these observations I found. So I chose the like games engine Dreams, which is by Media Molecule and published by Sony Interactive. It's on the PS4. This is my first attempt, and I wasn't immediately good at game development, which really annoyed me. And this is a cooling man sinking into the floor, and then I had to restart and do over completely. Then, like, using the kind of weird kind of tool set that Dreams has, you use the controller to kind of tilt and kind of, pick out things that you want. I created a garden, and I thought, wow, that looks really nice. Apart from underneath it, where you can see things. And then I started to make a platform game that kind of wanted to like hide these bits, but also give the player something to like kind of do, as opposed to just exploring this one platform. And also in Dreams, they encourage the players or the users to share their assets, and you can go into things and search them, and find out like which kind of things you want to put in the game, and they all belong to certain other users who are like ranked in terms of like art and interactivity, sounds, so on and so forth. And this is just more progress shots that I have, and I think the next one will show you the menu bar that is all like controlled with the like motion sensors, that you can kind of pick bits and pieces, like other assets that you want to make, any like film making tools at all. Yeah, and as I was moving around, these are some other like menus I found. This is like how I did a cutscene, and yeah, that's pretty much. And yeah, but my like kind of methodology is kind of action research and kind of interrogating this, and developers often show difficulty in explaining their work to others, be that due to like kind of shyness or anxiety or even PR training, and like legal kind of requirements, they're not going to be very like forthcoming, and especially with like the cyborg wave in like video game development, like masculinity and being like technological mastery, this kind of supports and challenges that wave, because yeah, I made my own game, and you can go and play it, but you can only go and play it if you have PS4, and you don't have to find it. And once again, it's like an alternative project, which is like that final bullet point. It's an alternative project, like product of my knowledge, but once again, like it's not super accessible if you don't use those platforms. So it's just kind of weird tension. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm happy to be here because I was squeezed in at the last minute by the committee members, so thanks very much. I'm from Singapore, and over the past 10 years or so, my team and I have been working with schools in Singapore and the region, and just I'm a geographer by native profession, just like all of you here. So I thought I'd just focus on geographical aspects of my work. Very quickly, really used to using it because I just like hunch. So basically, we try to use the environments more as canvases of learner expression rather than as exemplars. So here we start with a blank canvas in 3D, still from a geographical point of view, the plan view. And then what we do is we allow the students to, like in this case, create their own river basins. And in the malleability of the environment allows such things to happen. And as you can see, so I mean, you know, you get like, so you get stuff like this, which if you're a geomorphologist, you would see what's wrong with it. It's okay if you don't see what's wrong with it, because that simply means you're not trained in hydrology, which is fine. Okay, but there's something wrong with this. Okay, but I won't insult your intelligence, but tell you what. So I used the word canvases earlier. So we operate in various environments such as Minecraft, OpenSim, Second Life, and we're also in AR, and in Arduino as well. All these platforms were mentioned earlier today. So yeah, just a couple of things, quick slides. So those of you who've been to Singapore, you would know that our landscape does not really look like this, but more like this. And this is a problem if you're trying to teach geography. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to allow the students to complement their fieldwork studies with immersion. Okay, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of VR. So these are just illustrations. This one is meant to illustrate how we've used immersive environments to help develop their understanding of contour lines. Because what we did is we get them to see from a plan view as well as from an orthogonal view simultaneously, and then we get them. And then finally, what they also do is we get the groups to go into the different z-axis levels and trace because the affordance of the environment has x, y, z. So they plot x, y on the graph, and then each group has a z, and then they overlay all the z's, and then you get that, which is good. Finally, just a little plug, BGM has asked me to helm a special issue on augmented reality. So if any of you are working in AR, and I did hear some of you, I know I didn't interact with any of you, but I was keeping my ears to the ground. And those of you who are interested in AR, I think this is a terrific opportunity because it's BGM. Okay, thanks so much.